Well, good morning, everybody. We'll go ahead and have you grab a seat. We appreciate everybody being here this morning. Happy Monday to everybody. We're encouraged to have a decent-sized live audience today, as well as we have a much larger crowd online. We thank those online for joining. We have a lot of elected officials on the legislative level, county level, city, state level tuning in. We have members of the press as well that are tuning in online. We appreciate that. And a lot of great subjects to go over today. So we want to welcome you to our 2021 Legislative Outlook Conference with the Utah Taxpayers Association. I'm Rusty Cannon. I'm the Vice President. And thank you for being here and thank you for tuning in. As I was planning these remarks, or our agenda last night, I started thinking how refreshing it is going to be today to just talk about Utah and talk about how well things are going in Utah and all the great things we have going. Juxtaposed with what's happened in the nation in the past week and all things that have happened, I think it'll be refreshing for all of us to talk about what's going on in Utah, all the positive forces that we have going from all the hard work that everybody here and those that are tuning in have done. So we're really looking forward to that. First of all, we want to thank our sponsors today. This wouldn't be possible without their generosity. We want to thank Comcast, Sinclair, Rio Tinto, and Micron for being sponsors of this year's Legislative Outlook Conference. We do our, yes, thank you. Let's give them a hand. We do also, for those that are attending, we have parking validations for you. Just see Autumn out in the lobby. She's got those for you. We were, unfortunately, Lieutenant Governor Deidre Henderson was unable to join us today. She was called out of town, along with the governor, as well as some members of GOMB that could have possibly also spoken. They send their regrets. They very much wanted to participate today. Due to the events last week as well, their budget will actually be released today. And so this would also be a little premature on that front as well. So they regret that they can't make it, and certainly we'll try again next time. I did want to talk briefly about members of the Tax Commission. Spencer, if you want to bring that up, thank you. They also were not able to be here today due to, I believe, to some hearings and some other things that they had scheduled. But up on your screen, you'll also see, and we will make sure we post this in the meeting materials, the Tax Commission has done a lot of hard work through interim and had 7 bills that are now through interim committees and ready to go for this session. As you can see, House Bills 39 and 40, as well as Senate Bills 24, 25, 26, 35, and 42. I know we're running through them pretty quickly, and we'll have those in the meeting materials. Don't feel like you have to take a photo of those real quick, but they are printed and numbered bills, deal with some cleanup and other issues in tax code that's important that the Tax Commission would be talking about today and unable to make it. So just want to make note of that. Now, our first speaker, this will be really neat. Brad Wilson. He's represented Utah's 15th district in Kaysville for nearly a decade and currently serves as Speaker of the House, just elected to his second term, position he has held since 2019. And we can firmly say that in his service in the legislature, he has been a champion for Utah, a champion for businesses, a champion for taxpayers and all citizens of Utah. So we're excited to have him here, excited to have him come and talk about some priorities for the House this upcoming session. Let's welcome him with a warm round of applause, Speaker Wilson.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you here in person and virtually as well. That's kind of a first for us, and there's a lot of firsts this year. Representative Handy, you looked a little better with your mask on. If you'd put that back on, that would help us out a little bit. Just kidding, Steve. Handsome as ever. So I want to start by saying thank you to the Taxpayers Association and Rusty for the great work that they've done. And, you know, we get a lot of promises for help and support to support good causes here in the state. And one of the things that is not lost on me is with the Taxpayers Association, it's not just talk. And I really mean that. You've been super helpful over the course of the last couple of years with some very difficult things, Rusty and Howard, and we appreciate you more than you know. So there's been a lot of headwinds around the country and here in Utah over the course of the last couple of years. And it's interesting, though, in the wake of that, in the face of that, the fiscal conservative nature of our state has led to a tremendous amount of prosperity for Utah, even in some difficult times, not just in the past, but now. And we've actually been very fortunate here in Utah that we're living in a time where we can keep taxes low, maybe even lower, and have a thriving economy, not just prior to COVID, but actually in COVID. And we want to talk a little bit about that. There's an old saying, though, from Will Rogers. He said, "Be thankful that you're not getting all the government you're paying for." And I think that's absolutely the truth. There's some things that we're paying for that we probably don't want. Hand in hand, taxes go with smaller government. And the Taxpayers Association's been a champion to help keep government small. There is, though, and I want to talk about this for just a minute, there's an area of shared celebration between the legislative branch and the executive branch, the governor's office in particular. And there's a lot of them, and we're looking forward to training up our new governor, the president and I, over the course of the next session or two. But one of these areas of shared celebration has been how Utah has stood out from the rest of the country in keeping government small. And through a lot of the leadership of Governor Herbert over the last 10 or 11 years, actually, I should say, the morning of Spencer Cox's inauguration, I said to Governor Herbert, I said, "It's been a really good 11 years. And he said, "It's 11 and a half. And I said, "No, it was a good 11 years. I'm not going to tell you when the 6 months were that weren't good, Governor, but we got a good chuckle out of that. So, but one of the things that we're all really proud of, and we know pride's a sin, but let's be sinful for a minute, is the efficiency of government. And we saw government become more efficient by about 35% between the years 2013 and 2020 across 175 systems that, in collaboration with the legislature, the executive branch, worked on to make more efficient. And because of this effort, because of legislative oversight, we have fewer state employees today than we had in 2002, despite Utah's population growing by 900,000 people. If we kept the same employee to citizen ratio that we had in 2002, we would have 4,500 more state employees today than we currently have. This represents about a $400 million annual savings to the state of Utah. So this is a significant reason that we should be celebrating. And part of the reason that we're able to do that is ensuring that we have pressure constantly on keeping taxes down and keeping taxes even lower. It forces the conversation about efficiency. So it's important that we continue to do that. And government can even get smaller. We can get more efficient. There's government we're paying for that we probably really don't need, as Will Rogers said. So COVID has been interesting over the last year, and that's maybe not the right word for it, but that's the word we're going to use. And it has highlighted really dramatic differences between how states that are managed responsibly are managing the pandemic and states that are managed irresponsibly are managing the pandemic. And it's also, COVID has exacerbated a lot of the pre-existing conditions and structural problems that exist in state government across the country. And unfortunately, in many of these states, it's exacerbated the negative trajectories that they're on. Fortunately, here in Utah, the reverse is very true. Over the last decade, we've made consistent and constant conservative budgeting decisions that have helped keep us healthy and helped us weather this pretty dramatic storm in ways better than most other states. And we did that through making wise budget decisions and also using savings and using them wisely. So I want to put these figures into perspective for a minute. And we've talked a little bit about, over the course of the last month through executive appropriations, that we've got actually growth in our state budget, both in ongoing revenue and one-time revenue. You'll probably get into some of that a little bit later today. But here's what's shocking. So we're going to have roughly $1 billion of growth in new revenue. Now, we think $450 million of that ongoing revenue is directly related to the stimulus that came out of Washington and probably phantom revenue that we shouldn't necessarily depend on. But nonetheless, over $500 million of additional ongoing new revenue is significant. Compare that to what's going on around the rest of the country. There is, if you add up all the other states, there is anywhere from a $350 billion to $490 billion budget shortfall in the rest of the states in this country. Yet we have revenue growth. If those states take their paltry combined $75 billion in reserves, in rainy day funds, those states are still going to be collectively $300 billion to $400 billion in the red. Yet Utah is in the black. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think that twofold. One is the framework of our state is very different. We've been very deliberate about right-sizing government over the last decade or two, and also making the right investments in infrastructure and in our youth. The only state in the country to increase education funding last year, and executive appropriations in December did something that's unprecedented in terms of making a commitment to public education in the future. I think you're going to talk a little bit more about that later today. The second ingredient, though, in addition to this framework, is our people. And we've talked a lot about this, but our people are healthy, they're happy, they're active, and they're very giving. And you combine that healthy framework of state government with those attributes of our people, and we're a very successful state, and that's the recipe for success. So we have been able to keep investing in infrastructure, we've been able to invest in education, and those things are very important. But I want to talk about what you're here to talk about today, which is taxes a little bit. And one of the exciting opportunities that we have as a state is to look at a tax cut this next session, and doing something during these difficult times for a lot of our citizens. Not too long ago, we set aside $80 million as a state, as a legislature, for a tax cut. We were ready to do something at the end of the last session, but with the storm clouds out on the horizon, we decided to tap the brakes on that in March of last year, and preserve that revenue just to make sure that we knew what we were dealing with as this pandemic kind of rolled in across the world. Well, we think we've got better line of sight to what's going on with that now, and hopefully we can get those storm clouds behind us. And I think many of us believe that it's time to return that revenue back to the citizens of this state and let them decide how they want to spend their money instead of the legislature deciding how to spend it. So we don't have a definitive plan settled on yet. We'll work with, the House will work with the Senate and the governor's office to figure out what that needs to look like. And it's probably a combination of one or all of the following. Social Security or military tax reductions, possibly restoring part of the dependent exemption, or a rate cut. And if we did a poll in here, we'd get as many different opinions about what that mix should look like as there are people in the room. But we'll go through our legislative process and determine what that mix should be and give that money back to the citizens of the state of Utah. So I look forward, as always, to working with my good friend and our Senate President, Stuart Adams, on figuring this out, and all of you. I appreciate very much the opportunity to be with you today, Rusty. We cannot take for granted how fortunate we are to be in Utah and have good people like all of you here in the room doing the heavy lifting. And we'll gavel the legislature into session a week from tomorrow and see what the exciting 7 weeks bring us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We appreciate that. So next up, we have a great speaker as well, Carlos Braceras. Carlos joined the Utah Department of Transportation in 1986. He was appointed acting director, before Carlos, before you get up really quick, I did have something really quick I forgot, Spencer, if you wouldn't mind bringing that up. We're moving our agenda, and I forgot to mention. This is a slide that we had in our materials along the lines of what the speaker had mentioned in our meeting materials. We've generated a few ideas for the legislature as far as a tax cut. And as he mentioned, there is a set aside for $80 million, and we are advocating for those cuts that he mentioned. A cut to the Social Security income tax on Social Security benefits for Utah citizens, as well as military retirement benefits. Those are bills that are being proposed by several representatives and senators, as you can see from the handout. That money is set aside and able to be funded, and a restoration of more of the dependent exemption that was lost in the 2017 tax reform on the federal level. So as you can see, those are some cuts that we're advocating. There's an additional cut that we'd like to advocate for as well. As the speaker mentioned, there is some one-time revenue available to the state due to the budget changes that were made during COVID. And right now, with that $1 billion one-time surplus, we want to advocate for a cut to the income tax rate. We think there's a way to do it in a safe and responsible way for the budget, in addition, helping taxpayers that are hurting during this recession with COVID and with the difficulties that we faced. So what we're proposing, as you can see, is a cut in the rate from 4.95 to 4.75 on a temporary basis for calendar years 21 and 22. Our proposal is then to make that cut permanent if and only if revenue comes in at a certain level based on projections that LFA and the legislature projects going forward. The beauty about this is that everybody wins with this proposal. This cut only becomes permanent if revenue comes in at a sufficient level to fully fund priorities for education and priorities for the government, essentially, is what they need. So it doesn't harm those that need that funding, but most importantly, it helps those that are struggling right now with the pandemic, all taxpayers, individuals, small businesses, businesses of any size, all those paying that income tax as it's withheld from paychecks, or they're making quarterly payments on it if you're a self-employed business owner. We think this is the right policy for Utah and would be a good addition to the arrows that we have in our quiver. And by structuring it this way, we make so that there is a chance for it to become permanent if revenues do come in where we think they could, and if not, the rate would go back to that 4.95%, but at least it would be a 2-year reprieve on income taxes. So that's something that we will continue to advocate for and wanted to mention to you today as well. We're happy to answer any questions on that after the conference today, and we'll be obviously talking to as many legislators as we can about that. But that's what we wanted to squeeze in there, Carlos. I appreciate you just holding on for a quick second. I almost forgot. But Carlos, if you want to come forward. As I was mentioning, Carlos joined the Utah Department of Transportation in 1986. He was appointed acting director of UDOT in May of 2013. And this is pretty amazing. In his capacity, he's responsible for, get this, UDOT's more than 1,600 employees. And here's the amazing part: the design, the construction, and the maintenance of Utah's 6,000 miles of roads and highways. Doesn't sound like a small job. He was named the 1998 State of Utah Governor's Manager of the Year and was the 1998 recipient of the UDOT Leader of the Year Award. Let's welcome our Director of UDOT, Carlos Braceras.
Thank you, Rusty. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today. You know, with this group, I think it's important to start off with a couple of principles that I have operated on in my service in government. One, I do not believe government should ever have as much money as it thinks it needs. I think government should be forced to make, I think the president just looked up on that one. I mean, yes, I believe that. I believe government should be forced to make hard choices. That means you can't do everything that maybe you would like to do, or maybe even the citizens think you should do. You should have to be able to prioritize, and you need to be able to select what's the most important thing to do. I believe that people make better decisions when they have a direct relationship between what it costs them for those decisions. And so with that, I know the speaker mentioned that we have, the Utah government hasn't grown. Well, the Utah Department of Transportation is actually several hundred employees less than it was 20 years ago. We're managing a much larger system than we were at that time. We're maintaining a much larger system, but we've been forced to become more efficient, and we use the private sector to a point that most DOTs have never even thought of. To give you an idea, so 65% of our design is outsourced to the private sector. We believe it's important to maintain core competencies so that we can actually negotiate fair contracts for the public's investment. So there's a certain level of work that we need to have our employees do so that they understand what it takes to negotiate a contract. We outsource, I'm sorry, I screwed that up. We outsource over 90% of our design. Our construction engineering is outsourced to the point at about 60%. And so no other state does that. But what that allows us to do, it allows us to bring the innovative capacity of the private sector in to partner with the department's engineers and great employees, I think, to provide better service. So with this, I'll just jump into this here. I've been asked to speak about our road usage charge program, and I'm going to customize it a little since I've spoken about that here before. But I think we all understand that transportation serves a vital role in supporting our economy and our quality of life. When you think about it, when transportation works, nobody notices it. You're able to go from where you want to go to wherever it is. You're able to go when and where and choose how you might want to do that. When transportation works, people don't notice us. It's when it doesn't work that we get people's attention. And so sometimes that makes it hard to be in this business, but we believe, and I know Governor Herbert and Governor Cox believe this as well, that transportation infrastructure is one of those core foundational pieces that government needs to provide. Obviously, how you do that is debatable. In Utah, we've been talking a long time about not only how we provide that infrastructure, but also how we fund that infrastructure. And we believe that the gas tax, it's been around for over 100 years. The state of Oregon was the first state to pass a gas tax back in, I think it was 1917. But it's been really good function for us. It's served really well for the last 100+ years, and it's going to continue to support us into the near future, but it's not going to support us in the next 100 years. And so we think it's important to, as we move towards a road usage charge program, and I'll talk a little bit about the why behind that in a minute, that we consider the pace at which we transition into this. We consider options for those that are going to enroll in it, and we consider what technology is utilized as we implement that. So I guess I have the slide control here. Yep. Okay, I'm going to start with this one here. So early on, we understood this was happening. So back in 2003, 2004, under then Representative Becky Lockhart's leadership and Senator Carleen Walker, the legislature put together a transportation planning task force. They met for 2 interim periods. A Senate president was part of that task force. But what came out of that task force is, and I'm going to just read this quote, is, all citizens benefit from having a viable transportation system, and an over-reliance on few traditional funding sources will not produce the revenue needed, nor spread the tax burden fairly. The state must broaden the base for which transportation systems are funded. Reliance on fuel tax alone will never be adequate for highway needs. So I want to stress something here that's really important. The gas tax is a multi-billion-dollar, nationwide, multi-billion-dollar mechanism that's existed for over 100 years. It is a very effective and efficient tax to collect, but it has in the last 20 years or so, it is becoming disconnected from that principle of how much I use versus how much I pay. So as cars become more efficient, or in fact maybe electrify, which is great, it's great for our environment, and it's absolutely the direction where things are going. But as that disconnection happens, people start to lose the ability to pay for what they're actually using. And that's where a road usage charge program would start to make a difference. So some of the advantages, disadvantages here of the different mechanisms. So what I'm showing here is a road usage fee at the bottom, fuel tax in the middle, registration fee. So that's that left column. And so the advantages of a road usage charge program really is it does scale with inflation. It has that user pay principle, that fairness piece that we think is so important. And we believe it's long-term, has a long-term sustainability aspects that the fuel tax does not. And so you can see how the registration fee and the gas fee fits into that. So a little bit on the path that we've taken, and I might be going the wrong direction now. I don't know what slide I'm on. Okay. Let's go here. So in 2015, the legislature passed a bill that allowed us to continue, I'll say, fiddling with a road usage charge program. We've been working on it in our research area, and we, for years, have been partnering with what's referred to as RUC West, Road Usage Charge Program West. 17 western states had put together a coalition where we worked on research projects together to try to better understand what it would take to implement a road usage charge program. And then in 2018, Senate Bill 136 passed and laid the groundwork for us to begin the implementation of was really the country's first operational road usage charge program. We rolled that out January 1 of 2020. So I know everyone thinks 2020 was all about COVID or earthquakes or windstorms. For us, it was really all about the road usage charge program that everyone was talking about, but it set up a voluntary option for both hybrid, plug-in hybrids, and electric vehicles to pay their annual fee, since they pay very little in gas tax. So what they could do is they can opt in to the road usage charge program in lieu of paying those annual fees that you see over here. And what they would do is pay per the miles they drive. And we've had quite a good success with this. Like I said, we launched it last year. Let's see here. This is the, you can see the website here. You can go to the website. We have various videos and frequently asked questions on the program. We did get more people enrolled in this than we expected. And I think on the next slide, you can see the amount per type of vehicle. So like just under 1,500 electric vehicles are enrolled in the program. But really what surprised us was the gas hybrids. The gas hybrids do not pay that much of an annual fee. And we had quite a bit interested in enrolling in this program. And so, you know, we set this up working on how we wanted to manage this. We outsourced the administration of this. So if you want to participate in this, you work with the private sector. We do not see, you know, the individual miles. We do not see where people drive. That's only between the vendor and the citizen. And all we see is this amount of miles was driven, and this is what the cost is, and we receive those revenues on a monthly basis. So one of the advantages, instead of paying a one-time upfront cost, these folks now pay a monthly fee based on how much they actually drive. Just touch a little bit on lessons learned here, because this is we are suffering from the more you know, the harder it is. Anytime somebody says something to you is simple, it means they have never done it before, or they haven't done it in a really long time. And so this is, as we got into this, this becomes more and more complicated. There also is not a developed industry to support this in the private sector. We are, in fact, pushing the vendor, and hopefully other private companies are looking around and saying, you know, this is a place, an opportunity to create a business, because there is not a large group of private sector companies that are there to support states as they move into this. So we think the pace is a really important thing in terms of how you step into this. It needs to be, we need to consider maybe making it dependent on market trigger points, such as fleet transformation, higher miles per gallon sales, cars, technology development, rather than just setting marks or deadlines on it. So thinking about the pace of implementation on this. And we are required to report an implementation plan back to the legislature in June of this year. We will be reporting what it will take to be able to convert all the fleet over to a road usage charge program by December 31st of 2031. And so we're putting together various scenarios right now so that we can present that to the legislature. The other one is, we think an important concept is the idea of choice. So the consumer should be able to have the choices in terms of how they report their mileage, and whether it be, you know, just a verbal reporting of the mileage, or using what we call the OBD2 port. That's a port that most vehicles have. Not every vehicle anymore has this. The Tesla, for example, does not have that. We have to enter into agreements with the car company, that we call them the OEM, the original manufacturing company, to be able to receive the information from the telematics in the vehicle. And that's the movement that most vehicle companies are going down, is they're going into the world of telematics there. And so the idea of giving people choices on how they report their information, the ability to choose your level of data protection and privacy, we think is an important concept. Right now, we have stepped into this with the idea that data privacy is key for success. People need to be able to control and manage their own data. Government should not have access to that. And then the third piece is technology, and as the technology evolves, it's going to help us in this game. Because the OBD2 port, so basically we have a little device that plugs into it, and that uses cellular technology to transmit the miles back to the private vendor. That's not cheap. You're paying the cost of the cellular transmission. The device is not overly cheap, and it's also not a great user experience. It's a very, I'll say, clumsy interface right now because there isn't a large market developed around this. So I think that ease of consumer use is going to be a big part that's going to develop here over the next little bit. I wanted to just touch bases on a couple other projects that we're working on that have the same idea, the same relationship between the amount I use, I pay for. And so we do operate an express lane system. So this is a variable priced express lane system on I-15. We currently have 80 miles up and running, longest continuous express lane system in the country. So the idea is to move people, not necessarily cars. So as the traffic builds in that express lane, the price to drive in there goes up for the single occupant vehicle. We're completing the next phase of this project up in the Davis-Weber area and expect to have that done by the end of the year. Representative Handy's saying, get it done, get it done. We're working. And that will make a big difference up in that area. But I think this is a path to the future for us, this idea of using price to attenuate demand or maybe help people make different choices. And so right now we design our highways for what we call a peak period, so a peak hour flow. So we may be building it for a level of traffic for 2 hours in the morning and 2 to 3 hours in the afternoon, but the roads have capacity through the rest of the day. Is that necessarily the way to spend the public's money? Should we be trying to get more usage out of that investment? And this will help, I believe, manage the flow and help to spread that peak out a little bit so that we can actually have a more efficient use of the transportation system. The other piece that I wanted to just point out, and I've got a picture on the top here, is our Cottonwood Canyons. I think everyone is probably familiar with what's going on in the Cottonwood Canyons. We're loving those canyons to death. They are an amazing resource. That's for a lot of people. That is what is Utah, are those the skiing in those canyons. And we have incredible congestion up those canyons. So we've been working on an environmental impact statement. We have 5 different alternatives. I would say that it has they're very different type of alternatives. 2 of them are bus alternatives with building mobility centers. Think big transit hubs with parking garages. We have 2 different other alternatives that are gondolas. Yes, gondolas. Going from the mouth of the canyon in different locations, going up to Snowbird and Alta. And then we also have an alternative, which is basically a cog railway starting at the mouth of the canyon and going up. What's underlying all of those 5 different alternatives is the idea that we would toll both Big Cottonwood and Little Cottonwood. And it would be variable price tolling in the canyons. That is needed to be able to help motivate people to make choices. So, if the toll is pretty high, maybe I'll take transit. Because we need to move a significant portion of people over to transit. We cannot fit another car up in the canyon. And so I thought this hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the EIS to date. We're moving towards trying to get to decisions here by the end of this year, early spring. Later this spring, we'll be putting out a draft environmental impact statement, and it will contain details on all these alternatives. But suffice it to say, tolling will be a big part of any alternative that's chosen. And so with that, I just want to thank the Taxpayers Association for asking us to be here today. We appreciate all the work that you do in partnership. And I don't know if you want...
Just a quick question for you, Carlos, before you're done.
You can ask me anything you want.
I didn't want to preempt the audience, but you mentioned with, for instance, Teslas, some other vehicles that don't have the port, they're still able to enroll in the RUC now. How does that work?
Yes. So what that means is we have to enter into agreements between the car company, OEM is the typical term you'll hear, like General Motors is an OEM, Ford is, with the car company and the department to receive that information. Now, one of the things that's, I think, a major hurdle that we have to get through in transportation, and we have to do this at the federal level, is the default position for most people in government is, give me all the information. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but I'm going to figure it out. And what we need to do is clearly identify the data that we need and the reason we need it. It needs to be a finite amount of data, and it needs to be obviously protected. But that data that we would receive from the car company would give us the amount of miles driven. Now, the next step to this, and I believe it's going to be a little ways off, is if you envision that people would pay for their miles driven, but that price would vary based on the time of day or the facility they were on. So the amount of policy levers available with the road usage charge program is really orders of magnitude more than we have with the gas tax in order to be more effective and efficient with the taxpayers' investment.
And on the road usage charge program, Utah is essentially leading the way. Are there other states that are as far along as we are, or are we at the tip of the spear on this?
I would say we are at the very tip of the spear. Oregon is right there with us. Now, it's interesting, Oregon was the first state to pass a gas tax. They were also the first state to step into the road usage charge program. January of last year, we jumped, I'd say, to the head of that spear, but they're right there with us. This is a national discussion. There's coalitions on the East Coast, the 95 Coalition, and others that are working to try to move this forward. It's been a discussion in the reauthorizing bills for the highway funding, and I believe there'll be funding for pilot programs going forward to help move the state of the practice forward.
Thank you. It looks like we have one other question. I'm going to bring you the microphone so those online can hear you real quick.
So with the road usage charges, do you envision that some portion of that money goes back to counties and cities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So currently the Transportation Fund, which is made up predominantly of the gas tax, special fuel, that's code for diesel, and vehicle registration fees, 30% of that is distributed to the B and C, to counties and cities, based on a very, I'll say, detailed formula given to us by the legislature. And I would anticipate the same thing being for road usage charge revenues. I don't look at road usage charge, Carlos doesn't see road usage charge as a supplement to what we're collecting today. I see it as a replacement. As the purchasing power of the gas tax goes down or even away, we start to transition to the road usage charge program. So that a whole idea of pace, I mentioned, maybe it's based on fleet replacement, but and that fleet replacement is going to drive how much money is being generated with the gas tax. That idea of basically backfilling it with road usage charge program and the transition might be the way to do it. So I see this as absolutely maintaining that sharing of the revenues with our cities and counties.
Thank you, Carlos. We appreciate it. Let's give Carlos a hand. Thank you, Carlos. Just the Taxpayers Association has been a proud member of the committee formulating the right usage charge program. We've been in full support of it and full support of his comments as the ride usage charge being an alternative to the gas tax, as one is throttled on, one is throttled off. Not in addition, but as a replacement, as we'd echo. Next up, we have the pleasure of hearing from our President of the Senate. Senator Stuart Adams, he represents Senate District 22 in Davis County. He happens to be my state senator. He lives up in Layton. He served in the House about 4.5 years before moving on to the Senate, and previous to that, he was 9 years on the Layton City Council. He was recently reelected to a second term as president of the Senate, and we're really excited to have him talk to us about what's going on with the Senate in Utah. So we'll welcome to the stage Senate President Stuart Adams.
Wow, it's really great to be here today, and it's even better to follow the speaker and Director Braceras. Before I get in my remarks, I have to say something about Carlos. It's great to live in Utah, we all know that, but it's really great because of the people and the state employees we have. I happened to serve on the Transportation Commission, chaired it for a couple of years in between the time I was in the House and the Senate. And got to know the Transportation Department really well, got to know Director Braceras very well. One of the things, as you listen to the speaker, we've actually decreased the size of government, and Carlos referenced it a little bit, is we outsource a lot of our work to the private sector. Why would we do that? I'll give you one example. We try to build things very efficiently in Utah, and we try to find the best ways to do it. Instead of actually going through the old process which existed, and Carlos, I'm going to talk about this a little bit, is you designed an interchange, and then you went out to bid it. And you found out that perhaps the designers weren't this, there was a better way to do it. So we pioneered in Utah design build concept. And as we did that, we looked and we actually said, instead of actually designing it before we bid it and asked the contractors to help us with the design. And the results of it were, and one that I think is just one example, was an interchange in I think, American Fork. And if you've been to the interchange, you actually get off the freeway and it's a diverging diamond. You're kind of making a right-hand turn, but you're making a left-hand turn because they shift the traffic onto the other side of the road. Has anybody been through a diverging diamond where you do that? Well, that idea came because we let the contractors actually try to design the project. That interchange costs less, it costs less money, and moves more traffic through the interchange. Now think of that for a second. When you have something that costs less and is more efficient, isn't that great for the taxpayers of Utah? And that's something that our Department of Transportation, that was one of the first diverging diamond interchanges in the country. And I would just say that we're fortunate to have Director Braceras, and I couldn't help but maybe get off of my subject a little bit, but get him a great compliment because we have a great Department of Transportation. And I look over here to see Howard and Rusty, but we miss you, Howard, in the Senate. The Taxpayers Association has done so much to help build the efficiencies and make sure that we have one of, I think, the best managed state in the country in Utah. So we do miss you, Howard, and I know you're talking about this retirement thing, and you didn't ask permission because I wouldn't give it to you, but appreciate all you've done. I think of this last year, it's kind of different, aren't we? I've got a blended environment. There's a few people here. I think I'm online with a few people. It's just a totally different feeling this year because of COVID. And I don't think any of us really thought we'd be in this type of a situation a year ago when we were at this conference. We have tried to find a way to manage this virus that came. And if you remember back in last April, we just barely ended a legislative session in March. And immediately we took efforts because we didn't know how bad the virus was. We actually shut down businesses, shut down the economy. And the challenges of trying to figure out how we balance people's lives, their health, and our economy was a severe burden on us. And we did something that has never been done in the history of the state of Utah. We have a requirement that we can't call ourselves into special session until 30 days after the legislative process ends, until our session ends. Almost 30 days after the session ended last year, we called ourselves into the first ever legislative called special session to deal with this virus. And one of the things we did there that I think was so very significant is we formed a commission. It was formed by the legislature. It had medical professionals on it, business leaders and legislators on it. And that was formed on a Thursday. And that very next Friday, I guess the bill passed on a Thursday. The people on the commission were appointed on Friday, and they met on Monday. Took all the data they could, and the very first thing they did is they voted to recommend that the governor expand and reinstate a non-emergency medical care. We were finding that in the shutdown of our economy, there were people that had appendicitis that weren't going to the doctor, and they were rupturing their appendix. There were people with cancer that weren't getting treatment, and there were unintended consequences. There were all types of unintended consequences from us shutting down our medical care and our economy. That happened on a Monday. They met again the following Tuesday, and they recommended that the governor move from a red to closed status to an orange and open back up our restaurants, our hair salons, our gyms, on a limited basis, trying to make them safe. And so what is the result of our effort? Again, our focus was to try to sustain lives and try to protect lives, which we all know are one fatality is one too many. But we also had to try to blend out how we protected livelihoods. The speakers referenced it a little bit, but on the screen you'll see that the other states that have maybe taken a different approach have a very different economic effect. California is projected to have a $54 billion budget deficit, and these are billion, they aren't millions. They're hard for me to quantitate in our Utah budget, but New York is a $59 billion deficit. In Utah, we have almost $1 billion surplus in one-time money, $500 million of ongoing, and and we actually probably have even more than that. So the economics difference of opening up businesses, and since last May 1, restaurants, hair salons, gyms, in one form or another, as safe as they can, have been opened in Utah for the entire part of last year. We're worried about people's lives. And you see on the screen a case fatality ratio. Let me explain case fatality. In Utah right now, we have around 306,000 cases. 305,999 was the number over the weekend. We have 1,392 fatalities. That gives us a case fatality rate of 0.004549. On the screen, we see it rounded up to 0.005. That is the lowest case fatality rate in the nation. It I think, is the second lowest in the world. Only Qatar has a lower fatality rate than we do. You can see the world has 2.2, the United States has 1.7. Inside of those numbers, though, we all know that there are people who are that have COVID that weren't diagnosed, that didn't go get tested. And we did a little study last June. They called it the HERO study, and it found that for every person that had been diagnosed with COVID, there was 1.5 people who had it. And so if you take the 300,000 number, times it by 1.5, that's around 450,000 people, add it to the 300. There may be as many as around 750,000 people in Utah that have had COVID. That affects our fatality rate. They call it infection fatality rate. If you use the 750,000 number, our infection fatality rate may be down around 0.002. And then a little other statistic that maybe you might want to know is that of the 1,392 fatalities that we have today, 1,071 of those are over the age of 65. 3/4 of the fatalities are over the age of 65. We've been pushing very, very hard since the vaccine has come out to try to move to that 65 and older population. You can see the effect it will have if we do that. Very, very happy. Last Friday, the governor finally announced that a week from today we'll start vaccinating those 70 years and older. Can you imagine what that will do for the confidence in our economy and for the saving of lives if we simply vaccinate those few 100,000 people that are over the age of 65? We can manage the viruses fairly well in Utah, and we're trying to do our best. So the bottom line is this. We have the lowest case fatality rate in the nation. We have one of the lowest unemployment rates in the nation. Last summer, Rich states, poor states rated us the number one economy in the nation, the number one state for economic outlook in the nation. They've done that now for 13 years in a row, and we have two of the top cities have been recognized the best position for recovery. So what specifically does this mean for Utah? And you'll probably talk more about this today. But last fall, if you remember, we had I think a third or a fourth special session. We did something that no other state in the nation was even thinking of doing. We actually gave our educators an increase, an inflationary increase as we committed to do. We increased our education funding by 2%. We actually had a 5.4% increase in our Medicaid funding. We had Medicaid growth, trying to take care of those people who needed it the most in the middle of a pandemic. We were able to fund that. We received about $1.5 million in CARES money, and we tried to use that money the best way we could. Obviously, disseminating testing, trying to buy protective gear and equipment were things that we did. But we also found a way to focus on businesses and to be able to help them either keep going or backstop some of the costs they'd had when they were shut down, and focused on trying to make sure that we kept our economy running and we kept businesses functioning. We know there are businesses that are still hurting today, and we're very mindful of those, but there's a simple principle that the only way we as a state can function and have revenue to pay our bills is if the private sector is healthy and makes money, because we get the taxes that come from their production. And we focus very, very hard on trying to do that. We also appropriated, if you heard what the speaker said, executive appropriations met in December and recommended that we actually give the teachers a COVID-related bonus, about $121 million of one-time money. And then we actually appropriated $140 million of increased funding for education. We appropriated a 6% increase in education funding last session. We cut that during the pandemic. We reinstated that, or the executive appropriations recommended, we reinstated it. So the benefit of a strong economy is not just the business community. It's education. It's everything we touch as a government. And I also believe it affects our mental health and the whole focus of what people are about, to be able to help people have a positive outlook and be able to make it through a very difficult pandemic. I thought I might touch base on a couple of things that we, let me go back. Let me make sure I'm on the right page here. There we go. I'll talk about some things we want to do as far as next session. The speaker mentioned a potential tax cut. I believe the 2021 legislative session is the year of a tax cut. Thank you. Whether it's Social Security tax cut, whether it's military retirement, or whether it's trying to reinstate the dependent exemption for those with large families. There's also a need to look at productivity. We know that when you tax productivity, you get less of it. And I think we need to look to see, and I think the Taxpayers Association is coming up with ideas of how we can actually reduce the tax on productivity. The other thing that I think we're going to focus on during the legislative session is a more equitable distribution of education funding. I see Senator Millner here. She's been focusing on that. We have to spend our education dollars as wisely as we can to get the most benefit out of them. We need to make sure that parents have more control of their education funding dollars also. Infrastructure. People have found Utah. I mean, people are coming from all over the United States. I don't know how many people, I've heard statistics, I'd hate to quote them, have come here from California just during the pandemic because they love what we're doing in Utah. They love our quality of life. They love our environment. They can actually do business remotely from Utah. But with that, we're seeing more people here. We need to take care of our infrastructure. Things like double tracking Front Runner, expanding our fiber networks. That's a big deal to be able to communicate. Water's probably a limiting factor on our growth, and of course, road construction, as you heard from Director Braceras. Economic development will always be part of our focus. A vision that targets growth. We've got some great opportunities with rural economic development. We've got an inland port that I think is the future. We all know that retail is a great thing, but Amazon has done fairly well, and I'm afraid, I think, as I go home, I'm not sure how many delivery trucks will arrive at my house today, and it seems like it happens over and over and again continually. So an inland port and to be able to get into the new economy is really important. We've got the prison development and Silicon Slopes, fiber and IT is probably, again, a part of our new economy. And then up north, Northrop Grumman is building, I think they're employing, 4,000 additional people and trying to look at the new way our military actually protects the country. And Utah is a big part of that and the growth there. So between rural and inland port and Silicon Slopes and the prison and Falcon Hill, our economic future is extremely bright in Utah. We're not going backwards, we're going forward. And I think as we enter this legislative session, there have been extreme challenges. Never in my legislative history, and maybe never in my life, have I felt so much pressure to try to find a balanced approach of trying to protect lives, livelihood, and try to do the right thing for the citizens of Utah. And I look forward to this legislative session where we can continue that. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you, President. That was excellent. So next up, we have Senator Ann Millner will be speaking to us. For those that I'm sure most are aware, a significant change after this election in November to Utah's tax structure and how education is funded. With Amendment G that passed and the related bill, HB 357 as well. And no one has been deeper in the trenches on this than Senator Ann Millner, as well as Representative Schultz, that have worked so hard on this issue. And it's significant. We think if other states in the nation knew how good Utah has it in this sense, they would be absolutely amazed. So we're excited to have her come up. She began her service in 2015. She represents District 18, which covers parts of Davis, Weber, and Morgan counties. She's had a great career in higher education, and she also serves as a member of Senate leadership as the Majority Whip, if I have that correct. Yes, welcome, Senator Ann Millner.
So thank you very much for the opportunity. I remember last year we were having conversations about how do we move forward and how do we make sure that we have the flexibility that the legislature needs to be able to fund the highest needs in the state at any given time, but also make sure that we have a strong, well-funded public education system that meets the needs of our students and our families in the state of Utah. And as you know, both of those topics are really important topics everywhere. And we worked long and hard, and I think I talked to this group in the spring. We were talking about what Amendment G would do and the difference that it could make for everyone. And fortunately, the taxpayers of the state, the citizens of the state supported us with their vote. So I want to share a little bit about the impact of this amendment and what I think it does. But I also would be remiss if I didn't tell you that when I came into the legislature, Senator Stephenson was the voice of education in the legislature at that time. So all the work I do is because he spent several years whipping me into shape and still continues to make sure I stay on track, and I am grateful for that, Howard, and for kind of how you helped me get ready and really understand these issues at the macro level and the difference that that has made for me, and we still continue this work. So what does Amendment G do? First of all, Amendment G said that we're going to provide some flexibility in how we use our income tax fund. Traditionally in the state, there's just been an earmark on income tax funds that we would use it for education. But what we know is that education is not just about what happens in the classroom, what happens in the interaction between teachers and students and or online in that environment. It's also about making sure our children come to school ready to learn. If they need glasses, that they have glasses. If they've got some physical needs, health needs, that we're able to meet those, that they're actually prepared to learn. And they're going to be better learners if they're prepared to learn. And I believe what Amendment G does by opening it up and allowing us to support children and people with disabilities, it really allows us to take a whole child approach to education in the state that I think the research shows us today is really important to make sure all of our kids are educated. What Amendment G also did, though, is it triggered the enactment of House Bill 357. And that's really critical when we think about the funding of public education. So what I say to folks is, you know, we have had for many, many, many years this earmark on a revenue source. But an earmark on a revenue source doesn't necessarily mean funds end up in the education budget. That has been just something, a decision that we have made year by year by year. And it also can fund public and higher education, and it doesn't provide any priority to public education or to higher education. So what if we put something in place that puts some priority around public education funding? And that's really what House Bill 357 did. The first thing it did is something we do have in the Constitution, is a uniform school fund. That is a constitutionally protected account for public education. There have been very few dollars from a small variety of sources that go into that, but it's not been our income tax funds. So what this does is say all the money that we have in the minimum school program moves over to the uniform school fund, and it will be constitutionally protected for the future. The second is that it will automatically grow our education funds as a priority in this way. Because it directs us to put into the base budget, as long as we have money, growth for public education, and also an inflation factor on the WPU, it builds a basic foundation for public education funding and a priority for that basic foundational funding for public education. We have never had that. It has gone always through just the general process, but this allows us to establish it as a priority. Now, I said when we have money, right? The question is, what do we when we don't have money? Because we know income tax is the most volatile tax. And one of the problems we have in public education, because we're really dependent on the most volatile tax we have, is that we will be increasing public education funding, the economy will be strong, we'll move forward, and then guess what? There's a recession. And we cut everybody's budget, and education funding goes down. And then it takes us years to slowly get back up to even where we were. And it's because we tied our education funding to the most volatile source of revenue that we can. So What we will do now when we have money is we will also put money into a public education stabilization fund. And we will put that money in there. We will be able to use it on a one-time basis in good times, but we will keep that money, we will build that money up so that it could sustain us over a couple of years. So when we don't have revenue, we're still able to go in and pull it out of that ongoing public education rainy day fund and fund growth and inflation factor on the WPU. That's historic. We talk about education rainy day funds, but they've always been one-time funds. And you can't use one-time funds to fund growth or to fund an inflation factor on the WPU, which is ongoing. We will now have a mechanism to do that. By the way, I just realized that Representative Spendlove is sitting over here. This is his bill. He ran this bill. I was fortunate to be the co-sponsor of this bill in the Senate, but this is his bill. So we wanted to hold to the promises of this. So you heard President Adams say that even when we cut funds in the session in June, because of the decrease in revenue we have based on the COVID pandemic, what we did was still say we want to stay true to our commitment of what we've talked about with House Bill 357, even before it was enacted. And we funded growth and we funded inflation factor, which meant public ed got a 2.2% increase in funding, even when we were cutting everybody else's budget, which probably also meant we had to cut others' budgets more in order to do this. But it said education, public education is a high priority for us in this state. Since then, Amendment G passed. So now we are starting the process of actually doing what Amendment House Bill 357 says. And so executive appropriations took the action in December to recommend that in the base budget, which means we really prioritize this, in the base budget recommended funding growth and funding an inflation factor in line with the legislation, and in addition to that, funding, putting money in the Public Education Stabilization Fund. So being true to exactly what we were asked to do, and we did do. But we also did more than that. As part of the process of cutting the budget back in June, we also passed House Bill 5011. House Bill 5011 said that over time, we had actually been given a very generous increase in the WPU to public education in the last session, a 6% increase. Clearly, we couldn't do that. And we went back to what House Bill 357 said and said, we'll do an inflation factor on this. But we will work to restore that full 6%. And we'll take a percentage of revenue, we said actually at 10% of revenue over time, revenue increases over time to do it. We wanted to make sure that, and that would have meant in current times probably taken us 2 or 3 years to do that. But we made it a priority to say we want to fully restore that now. We made this commitment, we want to pay that commitment back. And so we went above and beyond and restored the rest of those monies, and you'll see that's $140 million in addition for public education. In addition to that, we put more money in the Public Education Stabilization Fund. So we're worried, as President Adams and others have said, we're still worried. Even though there was a lot of stimulus money out there, and we've done fairly well in this state, certainly in comparison to other states, we've done very well. we're still worried about, if you don't have the impact of that stimulus fund, what that impact will be, and will we see a decline in revenue. So we wanted to make sure that we haven't had time to build up a lot of money. Let's put some money back right now to help protect us and carry us through if next year is not a good year. And finally, in addition to that, we put money in a COVID stipend for educators and staff in our schools. We know what a tough year this has been for everyone. We know that everyone is working particularly hard, and we wanted to make a difference for everybody. And our commitment is that going forward, House Bill 357 will be something that will guide the actions of the legislature. I actually believe it's historic, that what you're going to find is we're going to be able to get that steady increase in public education funding, that we're kind of straighten the line of public education funding in a way that will make a tremendous difference over time in the funds that our teachers and our kids get in our schools today. In time for questions?
Any questions from the audience for Senator Millner? I do have one. So will this, under the new structure of Amendment G, HB 357, it looks like the legislative body has easily been able to adapt, and that I guess the system still flows very smoothly with this new structure. Would that be correct?
Correct.
Yeah. And so do you foresee the long-term process for the legislature on budgeting and spending priorities? How does it need to adapt to this new paradigm?
I think what this does just says we're going to prioritize that foundational funding for public education. And you know that in the state we always have worked hard to put money back for growth and for some kind of inflation factor, but sometimes when times have been, when we've been in recessionary times, we've not been able to do that. And it's really clear when you look at a chart of public education over the long term in the state, take 20 to 25 years, that the problem is the downturns. And what this Public Ed Stabilization Fund does is say, we're preparing for that, so we are going to be able to continue to do that in good times and in bad times. And and it's really a Utah way. We are saving for downtimes. And I think that's a principle of being physically conservative and planful, but making sure we're funding things that are really a high priority for us in the state. And I don't think there's probably any of us in the legislature that don't know, for our constituents, education is their highest priority.
Wonderful. Thank you. Let's give Senator Millner a hand. Thank you, Senator. Just so those that are here know, we have quite a large online audience. We're now well up over 100 attendees online, and just a different world when you're used to everybody, crowding into a room and what have you. It's nice to know that people still want to hear you and are able to attend at home. Just so you know, we do have refreshments for those that are here out in the foyer. Those that are home can walk over to the kitchen, obviously, and get what they need. But those here, we do have plenty out in the hall as well. So next up, we have a real special treat. We get to hear from Representative Robert Spendlove. He's here kind of wearing one of his two hats that he wears. He's obviously a legislator. He served since 2014 in House District 49. He does serve in leadership as vice chair of the House Rules Committee. He is the chair of the Revenue and Taxation Committee in the House. But he's here today, essentially wearing his day job hat, as we would say, as an economic and public policy officer for Zions Bank. He brings his crystal ball today, and let's see how good his crystal ball is. And let's bring up Representative Robert Spendlove.
Great. It's great to be with you today. Well, really, it's just great to wear a suit for a change. I'm so used to wearing sweatpants and or jeans. In fact, someone commented when I came in, they said, "You're not wearing jeans." It is. It's tough getting back to, wearing real clothes again and actually seeing people for a change. But it's good that we can at least be having some semblance of getting back to things a little bit. So if you know my presentations, you know that I like to kind of go fast, so just expect that. And there is a lot of really interesting things going on right now in the economy, both nationally and in the state. So if you think about the book, The Black Swan, what we're experiencing right now really is the example, the perfect example of a black swan. What are they? They're extremely rare. They have a dramatic and severe impact, and they cannot be predicted or prevented. And that's what we're in the middle of right now. And I think you need to always keep that in mind as you think about the current economic situation, especially the part it cannot be predicted or prevented. The situation we're in right now was not due to any kind of structural flaws. It wasn't because of any mistakes made by anyone. It wasn't because of inefficiencies in the economy or mistakes made by Congress or the Fed. It was just kind of thrust on us, and we have to have a response that is commensurate with what has happened and why it's happened. So I just want to show you a few graphs to illustrate how dramatic the last year has been. So the first one, our monthly jobs report, which was released on Friday, it essentially shows at the national level how much our jobs have grown or shrunk. You can see the Great Recession on the left side, where over a 2-year period, we lost 9 million jobs. In the spring of last year, over a 2-month period, we lost 22 million jobs. Dwarfs the entire size of the Great Recession in 2 months. In fact, April alone, we lost 20 million jobs. Now, we've been coming back, and since then, from May to November, we gained back about 12 million jobs, but we're still down by 10 million jobs. Then when we zoom in a little bit, you can see that most of that gain happened in the month of June. So we saw big increases in May and June, and then we've continued to increase, but at a lower and lower and lower pace. So essentially the momentum has been dropping, and then on Friday, we got the news that we're now back negative again. So for the month of December, the U.S. economy lost 140,000 jobs. Remember, we're trying to rebuild 10 million jobs, and in December, we lost 140,000 jobs. If you dig into it a little bit, 500,000 of those job losses were in leisure and hospitality, and about 375,000 of that leisure and hospitality was in bars and restaurants. So that is the direct impact of the struggles that we continue to see because of the pandemic. And the pandemic continues to drive the economy. So what we're seeing signs of, and there's a very real chance that we could be entering a double dip recession. And a double dip is essentially you have a recession, and then before you can fully recover, you get another recession. And you see that. So this is showing the last several recessions that our country has experienced. You see the big U-shaped recession with the Great Recession. You see a V-shaped recession in the early 1980s. So the red line represents the current one, which is much more dramatic than we've ever seen before. But then we started to come back, and you can see the economy coming back very quickly, but then it started to slow down, and now it's starting to reverse, and we're actually going back down again. So the next few months for sure are going to be a tough period for our national economy. Looking at the unemployment rate again, and you're going to see this over and over again, these dramatic impacts that we've never seen before. So during the Great Recession, our unemployment rate topped off at around 10%. And then we saw that slow drop down coming out of that because our unemployment numbers remained relatively high for a long period of time. But we finally bottomed out, and a year ago, we were at 3.5%. Just think, 1 year ago at this conference, our biggest struggle was the labor shortage. Our biggest struggle was finding those workers. And then the pandemic and the recession hit. We jumped up to nearly 15% unemployment just overnight. The highest unemployment we've seen since the Great Depression. And while it's coming down, it's still at a relatively high level of 6.7% on a national basis. Labor force participation is a broader measure. It's essentially saying, of the total labor force, how many people are working or looking for a job. And you can see that we hit our high point in 2000 of around 67%. And then look at the big drop again from the Great Recession, where we dropped all the way down almost to 60%. Now, and the important part of this one, and I have a slide on this to show the Utah data, but we still haven't even come back to that pre-recession level. So we had kind of a slow drop happening following the Great Recession. That was essentially baby boomers leaving the labor force, but then it started to stabilize and go back up a little bit as the economy was improving. Then we got the huge slam from the COVID recession, and we aren't recovering to the degree that we need to be in labor force participation. Another really important one that I'm watching closely is long-term unemployment. So this is defined as unemployment that is more than 6 months. And the reason that matters is the longer someone's out of a job, the more difficult it is for them to get back into the labor force. They lose the skills, they lose the connections, and it becomes the longer we have, or the higher we have this long-term unemployment, the more difficult it is for the economy to return back to normal. And you can see during the Great Recession, it topped out right around 7 million people that were in the long-term unemployed. Where are we right now? So we're at 4 million, but think about it. We're only 9 months into this period, and this is unemployment that is 6 months or longer. So you can see how quickly that's going up, that long-term unemployed. I wouldn't be surprised to see that surpass the levels that we saw in the Great Recession, and we're already higher than the previous 3 recessions before the Great Recession. So we're starting to see those struggles of long-term unemployment in our labor force. This one is one that always surprised. It actually surprised me when I first saw it, but it is an indication of how the recession is hurting different groups. So if you look at that, our long-term average of wage growth is about 2.5%. And then going into 2020, we were right around 3 to 4%. And then the pandemic hits, and what happens? Our wage growth jumps up to 8%. And you may say, well, why in the world, when we're in a pandemic, when 22 million people lose their jobs, how can we see wage growth spike up to 8%? What this is showing is it's showing who's being impacted by the pandemic and by the cutbacks. It's essentially the low wage workers that were overwhelmingly impacted by the recession. It was those hourly workers, blue-collar workers, those people in bars and restaurants that are just barely scraping to get by. 22 million of them lost their jobs, and so it skews that wage growth up because it's the white-collar and the higher-paid workers that overwhelmingly, essentially, were able to keep their jobs and weren't impacted as greatly as lower-paid workers. So it dragged that up. Now, as people started to return back into the economy, you see that wage growth dropping down. But again, the numbers released on Friday showed that wage growth spiking up again. And again, it's a reflection. Remember, those 500,000 leisure and hospitality jobs that were lost in December were, again, those people right on the line, those people really struggling. You know, we talk about kind of the shape of the recovery, whether it's going to be a U or a V. What a lot of economists are talking about is a K-shaped recovery, where those that are doing well are doing just fine. They're doing really well. but those in the lower income areas are really suffering right now because of the current situation. And we're seeing signs of that all over. When we look at GDP, our broadest measure of the economy, we really see how dramatic this has been. So this is going all the way back to 1948. This is the largest kind of time series that we have. I wish we could go back like 100 years so we could see the Great Depression and have some direct comparisons. But the lowest we've seen in this data series in the drop was about 10% in the late 1950s until last year. In the second quarter, we saw a GDP drop of 31%. But then, you see in the third quarter, came back 33.4%. So we see these huge swings. So when it's all said and done, the 2020 recession may be characterized as the most severe recession we've seen in our nation's history, but also the quickest recession that we've ever seen, where it started and stopped very quickly. Now, you may look at this and say, okay, well, we're down 31, but then we're up 33, so we're out of the hole, right? So we're good, GDP's back. But if you look at the absolute value of gross domestic product, you see that we're not there yet. So we were at about $19.3 trillion in the fourth quarter of 2019. Even with this dramatic recovery, we're still at $18.6 trillion. So we're about 3.5% below our pre-recession peak. And again, kind of the dynamics of statistics, even though we're 3.5% below the high, it would take 15% growth in fourth quarter GDP to get back to that previous level. We are not going to see 15% growth in GDP for the fourth quarter. So we will continue to be lower than that pre-recession peak, and we will continue to kind of struggle to get back to where we were before the pandemic hit. Part of the reason for that is consumer confidence. And you can see the big jump in consumer confidence in 2016 and 2017, where consumers and businesses felt very good about future economic prospects. Stayed at a very high level for several years. That green line in the middle indicates that people feel like the economy is prosperous, that it's a really good time to be engaging in the economy. But then the pandemic hit, dropped down to around a level around 80 or 90, and it's just kind of stayed there ever since. So consumers don't feel the confidence that they had before the pandemic hit. They still feel nervous about our economic prospects. This is another one that just kind of shocks you. And again, just these crazy spikes. So this is the personal savings rate. So it's kind of like the aggregate saving of all people in the nation. And you see our high point was in 1975, around 17%. Again, until this year. The pandemic hits, we go all the way up to 33.7% savings rate. Now, why would that happen? It's essentially a combination. So you've got low consumer confidence. People are nervous about their finances. They're nervous about losing their jobs. And then you have federal government support, kind of this flood of money coming from the federal government, whether it's the PPP program or the direct payments or the unemployment insurance support. So we have just this money coming in to households. And then when you couple that with people having low confidence, and then we have kind of a breakdown in the supply chains, right? We're actually struggling to find ways to spend money. You can't go on vacation to Europe. You can't do a lot of things that you used to do. You can't go to the movies. And so what did people do? They just kind of held on to that. Now, that's a problem because the goal of that federal stimulus was to inject that money into the economy, get it moving through and supporting economic growth. But what we see is that in very large numbers, people just kind of held on to that money. Now, it's come down a little bit, but we're still at a very high level of around 13% in the economy right now. When we look at Another sign of that is the nature of demand for different products. This chart is really interesting. The green is showing oil prices, while the blue is showing active U.S. oil rigs. It's essentially a measure of oil production. You can see the supply-driven crash of the late 2014, early 2015 period, where Saudi Arabia flooded the market with cheap oil to drive prices down. What we saw this year was a demand-driven crash in oil, where because our demand for oil essentially evaporated overnight, the price of oil essentially went from $40 a barrel to negative $40 a barrel overnight. There was about a 3 or 4 day period where the price of oil was negative $40 a barrel. You had to pay people to take oil off your hands. Now, it's come back, and it's right around $50 a barrel now, but look at that rig count. We were at 1,600 in late 2014. Today, we're at 260. And I don't expect that number that level to recover to where we've seen anytime soon. Look, so the Federal Reserve was very aggressive in addressing this. You can see how the Fed cut their federal funds rate all the way down to zero in reaction to this. The Fed has said they will use every tool in their tool belt to help support the economy and fight the downturn. One of the concerns about that, though, is when you've got all this money coming in, right? The money just dropping from a helicopter, that generally turns into inflation. And this is one of the big debates going on right now. And we really don't know for sure what's going to happen. On one side, you have the Fed, Jerome Powell, saying, well, look at the inflation data. You know, our goal is 2%. Where are we right now? We're at 1.2%. And we've seen several instances of deflation. Deflation in the Great Recession was caused by the housing collapse. Deflation in 2014, 2015 was caused by that collapse in oil prices. And we almost saw deflation earlier this year as the economy collapsed. So our pressure right now is on deflation, not inflation. However, bond markets are starting to disagree. And if you saw the 10-year bond jumped to over 1% last week, because there's increasing expectations that this new round of federal stimulus, coupled with pent-up demand, will create hyperinflation, not in the near future, but maybe in the second half of 2020. We're going to start to see inflation like we saw pre-Great Recession at around 4 to 5%. I don't know where I come down on that yet. I'm still kind of studying it, but there is this mounting debate going on within the investment and economic community about whether we're more deflationary or inflationary in our trends. Kind of looking locally, as tough as things are nationally, things continue to look really good locally. Utah was the fastest growing state in the country over the last 10 years. Not only that, you see we're right in the center of the fastest growing region of the country. We continue to see very strong population growth throughout the Intermountain West. Utah and Idaho are always kind of battling it out. And also Nevada and Texas have been seeing very high population growth recently. When we look at where it's happening, look at that. Washington County continues to be one of our fastest growing counties, growing at 4.1%. Utah County growing at 3%. The only county that lost population was Grand County last year, lost just a little bit of population in their county. When we look at job growth, now this title is a tiny bit misleading. It is accurate to say that Utah's job loss is the lowest in the country. However, there is one state that actually saw job increases, and that was Idaho. So Utah is number 2 in terms of the job market, I guess you could say, in the country. And I would expect that in the next month or two, Utah will also flip positive. But then you compare that. I mean, look at California and Nevada, negative 7%. New York, negative 10%. And Hawaii, down 15%. So you can see those, just like President Adams said, it's kind of a combination of those states that have been very strict in their shutdowns, and then also states that have very specialized economies have been hit really hard in the recession. When we look at kind of the whole picture for Utah, we're down by about 7,800 jobs. So that's good. We lost about only almost 150,000 jobs, and now we're down by 7,800. But you can also start to tease out some of the winners and the losers within the state. So on one side, leisure and hospitality is still down 24,000. So their losses, they're actually a drag on the overall economy right now because of those job losses. However, on the other side, construction is up by nearly 6,000. So we see real strength going on in the construction industry and adding a lot more jobs very quickly. When we look at the change by geographic area, this is also really interesting. So again, remember the state is essentially zero, but you see big increases. Utah County up 1.8% versus Summit County down 13%. You see, what was the other one? Davis County is up 1.7%, but then the Uinta Basin is down around 7%. San Juan County down 7%. So we're seeing some big divisions where some counties are doing really well in the state while others are suffering immensely. And this is as of right now. This is, just what's the latest data that we have. When we look at the unemployment rate, is one of the lowest in the country. It's actually interesting because, with such a strong job market, you would expect our unemployment to be the lowest in the country. But we're only number 6, and there's several states kind of in the in the Midwest that are lower than Utah's. But there's an interesting dynamic that explains that. So this is looking at that labor force participation rate again. The green one is the U.S., the blue is Utah. Now remember how I said the nation's labor force participation has not recovered back to its previous level. But look at Utah. It actually, a few months ago, spiked higher than it was pre-recession, and now we're right around our pre-recession level. So what does that mean? It means that because the economy is so strong, we're pulling more people off the sidelines and back into the labor force. That's driving up that labor force participation, but it's also driving up the unemployment. So this is one of those rare cases where an increase in unemployment is a sign of a strong economy. So it's something that I expect as we continue to see strong job growth, that we will continue to see more people coming into the economy and higher migration from other states. When we look at the unemployment rates, kind of a similar trend. You see there's a couple counties, look at Cache and Rich, are still right around 3% unemployment. They recovered very quickly from the recession. Utah County, 4.3%, but then you jump over, again, Uinta Basin is double digits, San Juan County, 11%. So kind of this dramatic divide between the urbanized Wasatch Front and the more rural counties that have much more specialized economies. Looking at one of the results of the current situation is we're now seeing the highest home values that we've ever seen in our state. So if you just go back 10 or 15 years, Utah's home prices matched the U.S. And remember, how we talked about the huge bubble of the Great Recession, the bubble in home prices that was going to pop, and it did. So you can see, the Utah home prices dropped down, but where are we now? We're way above where we were at the height of the bubble, and we see our home prices much higher than the national average now. When we look at in calculus, you call this the second derivative, or the growth rate. So we're comparing the growth rate here, and you can really see the reason for that change. And I just want to point you out to the last year. So this period right here, kind of this trough, is February of 2020. And so you see both nationally and in Utah, we've seen that housing price appreciation accelerating. So there's a combination going on at the national level. It's because the Fed dropped those rates down, pulled down those mortgage rates. 30-year mortgage rates are at all-time lows. So that increased demand for housing. and drove up home prices. But in Utah, you couple that with the increased demand from the increased migration going into the state, and also overall, we just can't build houses fast enough to keep up with the demand. I heard an example just recently that a year ago, in the Davis County home market, there were about 700 homes on the market. Today, there's 100. So you can just see that demand is shrinking and shrinking and increasing those overall prices. So, and again, you know, this is great if you own a home, right? It's great, you know, you can charge more for your house, but what if you're a first-time home buyer, or just coming out of college, or just trying to move from an apartment into a home? It's becoming more and more difficult for younger people and lower income to get into homes, and that's something that we've got to be thinking really seriously about in the legislature. Kind of bringing it all together, again, I want to stress, this was caused by that black swan event. It was caused by the pandemic. It's not because of any inefficiencies or problems in the economy. In fact, the economy was really strong going into the recession. However, we're there now, and we're in the middle of it, and we don't know exactly how it's going to end. On the positive side, with the development and the widespread distribution of the vaccines, that should provide a boost to the economy in the longer term. If you kind of think third and fourth quarters of 2021 should be really strong. We should see a lot of growth. But in the next few months, there's going to be a lot more pain, especially as the virus continues to spread. We're seeing more need for shutdowns. That's going to cause real strain on the economy. And so I think we're in for in the short term, we're in for a period of continued struggle. But ultimately, we will be able to recover. And I think the economy will be really strong once we're through this period and once we have control on the virus. But the economies of Utah, the economy of Utah, and I would say of the Intermountain West, is really strong, and we will be able to get through this. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Representative Spendlove. We appreciate it. Gives me great comfort that Senator Hemmert just walked into the room and is here. I was going to tell a quick story as I introduced Senator Hemmert. I went to look for bioinformation on the Senate website, and you've been wiped. Like, it's gone. Like, I think they still have your picture, but all the data was gone. So I had to look elsewhere for your bioinformation. We know you well, but you know, for those that are tuning in, Dan Hemmert, he's the executive director now of the Governor's Office of Economic Development, also known as GOED. Prior to his appointment, Hemmert owned and operated Red Hanger Cleaners, a multi-store retail dry cleaning operation, and a disaster recovery fabric restoration business. He also was a partner in 5 restaurants. In addition to dry cleaning, he served part-time in the Utah State Senate, as we mentioned. I don't know if I'd call that part-time. I'd say that's full-time in the State Senate, where he was the Republican Majority Whip. He's a great asset to Utah, is an advocate for business, an advocate for the economy, an advocate for all Utahns, and we appreciate him being here. I'll still call you Senator or Director Dan Hemmert.
So the best part about not being in the Senate anymore is people can just call me Dan now. I never really enjoyed people calling me Senator Hemmert. It sounded more like someone cooler than I was hanging out in the room. So I'll be talking about, and I also am not surprised that they wiped me. Former Senator Stephenson went through this recently. Yeah, there's not a long memory there, you know, it's like, get out. But I was asked to speak today about things we could do to improve, you know, the economic outlook here and be more competitive in Utah. And since this is the Taxpayers Association, obviously I'm going to end talking about a tax issue. But before we get into it, I just wanted to talk about, just hit really briefly, 6 things that a government can do and specifically a state government can do to improve the economic competitiveness of that state and help that state be more effective economically. One, and this is in no particular order, and I'm not going to do much more than just mention them as I walk through it, but one, teach the children well. Fundamental education and children's education is critical, and it's what has led to the United States historically leading the economic charge. And we need to get smarter about digital learning. We need to get smarter about how to recognize that a teacher does matter, and the right teacher matters, and improving that. But that's something that government can and should do to improve its economic outlook. Another one is to refocus on startups. Most job creation occurs within the startup realm. It does not occur within large corporations. In fact, they're incented to eliminate jobs as they become more efficient and better at what they do. And you see that. The data proves this out. Large corporations shed jobs. New companies create jobs. And so focusing on startups and entrepreneurialism. Next, make more matches. Facilitate. We have private companies doing this, but also government can help with this. Facilitate transition from job to job, from company to company. Help those who are employed move to better opportunities or different opportunities, and also help those who are unemployed find employment opportunities. Another one is to support scientists. I have a bit of a history with a former government organization called USTAR. Not a great history with it, but one thing that the idea was good, to help scientists, help independent research. Economic advancements and growth does come, and there's a lot of data showing this, does come from innovation, and a lot of that innovation occurs at our universities. The federal government does a ton here, but as far as Utah as a state could be helpful in helping people access grants, et cetera, from the federal government, that is something that could drive positive economic outlooks. Next is upgrade infrastructure. This is, everyone knows this. This is not new, and this is something where governments do focus a lot, is infrastructure improvement. And Utah is ahead of its other states in a lot of regards here, but it could always do more. And we're always excited and happy to see that. Lastly, and this is where I'm going to spend the rest of my time. Man, it went fast, so sorry. But since we must tax, we should tax wisely. And I'm going to talk about, there's three main types of tax. You probably heard this 18 times or 1,000 times already at this conference. You can tax what we own, we can tax what we make, and we can tax what we spend, or how we spend. And I'm going to focus in on that last one. In particular, sales tax. We use a sales tax here. Most countries use a VAT tax or value-added tax. 85% of countries use a value-added tax, and the U.S. is the last major economy that's still using a sales tax and not using a value-added tax. But we have a sales tax. Sales taxes are good. They work fine. The idea behind it is the final user of a good or service pays a sales tax. Unfortunately, in this great state of Utah, we have many incidences of what is called tax pyramiding, where you are not paying the sales tax on the final good or service. In fact, you are paying sales tax on sales tax that has occurred the whole way up. We're pretty good at eliminating this when we're talking about goods. You go to the restaurant, you buy a salad, they did not pay sales tax on the lettuce, they didn't pay sales tax on the mayonnaise they used to make the dressing, and you only pay sales tax on that final salad. We're not so good at this in other areas. For example, the software industry, we're not good at this at all. We're paying sales tax on top of sales tax. A lot of inputs that go into that final product are taxed. A lot of service businesses, and we need to avoid the fallacy that we don't tax or submit services to sales tax in Utah. That is not true. There's a lot of services that are subject to sales tax, but in the service industry, same thing. A lot of the inputs that go into that final service are subject to sales tax. And it is something that Utah could do that would make a splash. It would be newsworthy if we very aggressively went after eliminating the pyramiding, the tax pyramiding that is still occurring in our sales tax infrastructure. And in fact, Senator Lincoln Fillmore is running a bill to do just that this legislative session. I hope we support it. And I think I've gone over, and thank you so much for letting me be here. Excited to be part of this conference. It's a great conference, and the Taxpayers Association is a very important voice for the Utah taxpayer. Thank you.
I'm Howard Stephenson, if you didn't know who I was, because Rusty is kind of the big deal now. But he's being interviewed by KSL right now, so I'm going to introduce our next speaker, which is Senator Wayne Harper. When I started in the legislature in 1993 with my young family, shortly after that, Senator Harper joined in the House of Representatives. And we were at a family event at the Natural History Museum, and I thought that my 5 kids kind of took up a lot of space, but then enters Cheaper by the Dozen. And Senator Harper and his wife have several children of their own, and then they adopted 3 more that were related family members. And it was just such an amazing thing to see that he could handle that many kids. And that's helped him in his Senate role, I believe, because he has been exceptional in tax and spending in Utah and controlling those. He is basically part of why we made a good transition to streamlined sales tax. He served on the National Streamlined Sales Tax Task Force for, I don't know, a dozen years or so. And that way, when Wayfair decision was made, Utah was instant in transferring to that, and we got some major tax cuts as that new online sales tax kicked in. And that's why we finally got the 3-year life sales tax removed, is because of the work that he laid for many, many years in working on the national and the state legislation. So I'll let him explain his family size as he comes up here.
Well, it's good to be with you this morning. There are a lot of good things happening. You're going to find a very interesting personality in the 2021 session with a number of new legislators and especially a bunch of new cabinet officials and agency directors in the executive office, as well as a new governor. I want to talk to you a little bit. No, I'm not going to tell you that I have only 11 kids. That's it. So you open up the school bus door and there's the flood and away we go. So we have a lot of fun. I want to talk to you about a very important bill that I'm running, which is Property Tax Amendment Senate Bill 18. And let me give you the basis for this. And it's numbered. It's been out there. It's been through committee during the interim and has had a favorable recommendation out of that. Bottom line, all of us have been impacted negatively by COVID. Health-wise, some employment-wise, monetarily, there's just been a lot of negative things. To combat what I think has been maybe some inopportune shutdown decisions that have negatively impacted a lot of our businesses, the federal government, state government, and counties, Utah counties as well, have invested hundreds of billions of dollars into a campaign to save small business after they forced business shutdowns. Government, by these actions, these monetary actions, clearly wants to reduce the burdens on businesses. So I came up with a bill after discussion with a number of small business owners and associations, Senate Bill 18, which is property tax amendments. This bill, I think, will be the final solution, if you will, for what we've been dealing with for decades on how to handle personal property, business personal property, and what to do with it. It goes and it defines, clearly defines, what is inconsequential or a de minimis amount for business personal property, setting that threshold at $50,000 from its very low rate at 15,000 days. So we're going up to 50,000. It simplifies what happens to businesses that are above and below that threshold by reducing or eliminating annual scheduling of business personal property, allows somebody who's underneath that threshold to submit a simple letter to the county saying that they are under that threshold and they don't need to have the invasive audits from the county or the tax commission. I believe it creates equal application under law, clarifies the cliff provisions that is being handled differently by some counties above or below the line on your filing schedule. And it treats similar businesses and similarly situated property the same. Now, what does it bottom line do? Right now, we have nearly 85,000 businesses who have 15,000 or more business personal property that have to submit a schedule and be subject to audit each year. This bill takes over 52,000 of those businesses off the tax rolls, providing the relief that I believe the states, the counties, the federal government, the executive office has said is so important to keeping our small businesses open. It takes those 52,000 off for only a $17.6 million reduction on our property tax. Now, if you compare that, we remove $17.6 million off the tax rolls out of a $3.4 billion collection of property tax. That's a pretty small decimal fraction when you calculate that out. This bill, and this is I believe the one issue that is out there, this bill does not allow for a tax shift. This is a tax cut. So with this bill, I don't want to go through and shift business personal property tax from a business over to somebody on a fixed income, on a low income, or a senior citizen. This is a tax cut. So as you take a look at this, I'd like you to review this bill and understand the fact that it is business friendly, it's consumer friendly, and hopefully it will help keep some of our neighbors employed as their businesses stay open. Yes, it does have a fiscal impact, but I think that's worth it in order to fulfill the mandate that we've been given in order to reduce burdens on businesses and keep their doors open. And that's it. And we'll have some other fun tax cut bills, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Harper. That is music to our ears, music to the ears of small business owners throughout the state. And we hope everybody was listening there. Excellent. So next up, we have Kevin Burt. I just need to make sure, there you are, Kevin, great. These bright lights makes it tougher to see out into the audience, but we again welcome and thank all those that are watching online. We have quite a large crowd online, as goes in today's world, and we appreciate you tuning in. This is an interesting story to hear about. We talk about how great Utah's positioned throughout the country in comparison to other states, and the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund is no exception. He'll explain it, I'm sure, and he does a great job as director. He's always been very helpful to us and very helpful to business owners throughout the state. But our unemployment, I don't want to steal your thunder, our Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund is in great shape, relatively speaking. I'm safe to say that, and we're excited to hear the details. So let's welcome Kevin Burt, who is director of our Utah Unemployment Insurance Division. Kevin.
Good morning. Yeah, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about unemployment insurance specifically in the state of Utah, and I have a couple graphs that just kind of point it. Representative Spendlove talked about a black swan event, and you'll see that in my graphs as well. So this is how many claims we took in year 2020. We took 387,000 claims. And then you can see the year before is 57,000. So there's just nothing like this that we've ever experienced before in unemployment insurance. You can see each recession, what happens historically with recessions is you'll see a gradual increase in unemployment claims because the economy is starting to struggle. But this was just an immediate shutdown of the economy overnight and a massive amount of people needing the unemployment insurance benefit. And even if you look at the peak during the Great Recession, it was about 165,000. We're more than double that in 2020, the number of people that filed for unemployment claims. And the same with the amount of money that has been paid out. 2019, we paid out $150 million. In 2020, we paid out $1.7 billion in unemployment insurance benefits. Now, that comes with the volume, but it also comes with the stimulus. On about 70% of the $1.7 billion that was paid out was federal stimulus funds or federal unemployment benefits that were added to the program with the CARES Act and now with the Continued Assistance Act. But again, you can see just the difference it made compared to the Great Recession, where we paid out 116,000 or 816 million, which again had a lot of federal stimulus benefits, but not near to the level that we saw in 2020. I thought this was kind of interesting. What I did is I took a look at what was the unemployment rate in the month of January for every year back. And what you can see is during the Great Recession, you saw a gradual increase in the unemployment rate. And then it took years to recover. It peaked in January at an 8%, but it took years and years to recover. And you can see January 2020, we were at 2.5% unemployment, which is just a year ago, but it seems like a lifetime ago. But it just took years to recover. And so what happened during 2020, you actually see a very similar trend in that the unemployment rate, how fast it recovered in the state of Utah, just month to month. So it didn't take years to recover. It actually just took months to recover. And that's because the economy started to recover, the economy started to open back up, and a lot of people started, what we believe were furloughed, started returning to work and no longer needing the assistance. Now, it is remaining stubbornly high, though. It's still 2% higher than it was before the start of the pandemic. So we're certainly not recovered, and COVID-19 continues to be disruptive to employment, but we have seen some recovery with that 4.3% unemployment rate. And another thing that I think is important to look at is this is a graph that just shows how many unemployment claims were filed every week during 2020. And so you can just see what happened in our office in just a matter of weeks. We received more claims than we'd received in a year. And it was 33,000 about at its peak. And you can see that bottom line was how much we averaged in 2019, 1,100. So we're about 30 to 40 times more claims in a single week during early April, that just the demand was overwhelming because the economy had just shut down. And then you can see it recovered rather quickly, but then again, it's still remaining relatively stubbornly high. It's still 4 to 5 times more now than it was in 2019 in the number of people who are filing for unemployment claims. And then if you see the very last week, it went up to about 5,500, which is the highest it's been till back about in June. Now that's directly related to the Continued Assistance Act being passed. Remember, unemployment insurance is time limited. It is not an income-based program. So when a person applies, we look at what their income was, and then they're eligible for a certain dollar amount in a certain number of weeks. Once they have exhausted those weeks, the benefit ceases to be provided to them, even if they remain unemployed. What the Continued Assistance Act did is it extended those and provided additional weeks that are fully federally funded. So I do think that what we'll start to see is we'll see people who have still not been able to reconnect back into the workforce come back in and reapply, and we'll see that line go up, and then it will start again gradually to decline as we enter into the warmer months, as the vaccine starts hitting. And again, it's only, the stimulus is only for about 11 weeks. So we do expect those weeks to go up, but then start to recover. So that is a promising sign to see just that it is leveling off, and the number of people filing for claims is certainly lower than it was last spring. And then this is continued claims. Unemployment insurance is you don't just file once, you have to every single week attest to what your situation is. So a continued claim is how many people are still asking for the benefit, not just people who have applied. And you can see at the peak it was about 130,000, and right now we're at about 27,000. So we certainly have seen that trend. In fact, that number had been going down for 34 consecutive weeks, the number of people asking for continued claim. Last week was the first time it went up, and again, since 35 weeks ago, but again, that's continued assistance. As the stimulus comes back, people who had exhausted will now come back in, and we will see that. So it'll cause another bump, and then I do expect it to recover rather quickly. And then state trust funds, as Rusty mentioned, I did want to talk a little bit about state trust funds. So remember, unemployment insurance is a tax paid for by Utah employers. It's deposited into a trust fund, and it can be used exclusively to pay out benefits. There's no administrative cost when it comes to that unemployment insurance tax that's put into the trust fund. It's only paid out to people who are eligible for unemployment, and it pays that direct benefit. So November 30th of 2020, this is when all the data, the most recent data I have, the national combined balance of state trust funds was $76 billion across the nation in December 31st of 2019. As of November 30th of last year, it's $26 billion. So across the nation, we have seen 66% of state trust funds dollars depleted and paid out in benefits, only remaining with about a third of what the balance was. And remember, this was after 10 years of good economic growth. So in theory, the trust funds were could have certainly been at their most solvent level. They could have been at their strongest level because you had 10 years of good economy to be able to replenish those trust funds. But then just in a matter of a year, 2/3 of them were depleted. 21 states across the nation in 9 months have gone insolvent. Meaning they have paid out more than their trust fund has. And what does that mean? Well, that means that they have to borrow federal funds. So they can't just not pay out people who are eligible for benefits. They have to actually borrow federal funds. And what that'll mean is over time, not only will those states that have gone insolvent have to increase tax rates to replenish their state trust fund, but those employers will also be hit with an increase in federal taxes to pay back the money borrowed to pay out the benefits. So employers will be hit in 2 different ways with the states that have gone insolvent. An additional 5 states are more than 75% depleted. And so that means that it's very likely another 5 states will go insolvent rather quickly. 6 more states are 50 to 75% depleted, and then 8 states are between 25 and 50%, and that's where Utah resides. Utah, as of that November 30th, was about 1/3 depleted, meaning we did pay out certainly an exorbitant amount of money than we ever have before, but prior to the recession, or prior to the pandemic, better stated, we had the 7th healthiest trust fund in the nation. And so 13 states are less than 25% depleted. Why is that? How were they able to survive? 12 of those 13 states actually took CARES Act funds that were provided by the national government and deposited that into their trust fund to be able to deplete less. Utah has not contributed CARES Act funds to the state unemployment trust fund. And then this one, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, okay, so now we need to replenish this trust fund. We know the money has gone out, so what does that mean for tax rates? One of the things that does determine a tax rate is called social cost. So social cost is what it's doing is unemployment insurance. If I'm an employer and I lay off individuals and they qualify for unemployment, then I have former employees that took out an insurance claim essentially against me. And so my tax rate increases because I have more of my former employees qualify for unemployment. So the best way to drop your tax rate is to not lay off people. So it's kind of built around if you have a strong business practice that doesn't lay off individuals, you'll have a lower tax rate. If you have one that does repeatedly lay off workers that qualify for unemployment, then your tax rate will go up, similar to a car insurance if you get into accidents. And so one of the things, though, is called social cost, where it's hard to attribute the tax rate to somebody. Let's say a business goes under and they have 10 people qualify for unemployment. I can't reassign those benefit costs to that employer that no longer exists. And so what we do is we do with social cost, and we spread it out across the 90,000 Utah employers. Now, with the pandemic, what happened is we had a significant amount of people that were furloughed. And it wasn't the business's fault because government asked them to shut down, and it certainly wasn't the employee's fault. They were unemployed through no fault of their own, so they were eligible. And so what we did is during the time period, if a person was unemployed because of the pandemic, we assigned that to social cost and spread it out across 90,000 employers instead of severely impacting. We talked a lot about the hospitality industry. If they're slowly recovering and then they just get hit very heavily with an unemployment tax on top of that while they're trying to recover, that'll just slow their recovery. So what this did is it spread it out across all industries to keep the tax rates low across all industries, but replenish that trust fund so that we don't go insolvent. However, during the special session, SB 5007 was passed capping that. And so what happens is usually the unemployment rate is lagging. We only set it once a year and only change it once a year. And so it's intended to lag, so not increase during a recession, but increase after a recession to start replenishing that trust fund. But because the demand was so immediate, it was going to trigger a higher tax rate rather quickly. And so what this bill did is it said, hey, if it's going to increase, it can increase beyond this. And so it locked in those rates. And so then you can see about 80% of employers in Utah only pay the minimum social cost rate, and that will increase from $36.60 per employee per year to $77.80 per employee per year because it locked in at that rate. And then for those that have experience, it also locked in the reserve factor. That 1.05 means that if you have experience, if you've had employees that qualify, if it's 1.00, you pay 100% of what's owed. If it's 1.05, you pay 105% of what's owed. So it locked that in. And then just kind of a quick summary. Remember in Utah, we had the 7th healthiest trust fund, but we also had experienced 6 consecutive years of reduction in contributions or taxes collected by Utah employers. In 2013, remember this is post the Great Recession, we collected $354 million in taxes. In 2019, that number was dropped by over $200 million without jeopardizing the solvency of our trust fund. And then prior to the pandemic, again, we had the 7th healthiest. In the Great Recession, 35 states went insolvent. Pandemic, we already have 21 states that have gone insolvent. And even with those rate increases, Utah still has the 10th lowest tax rate, unemployment insurance tax rate in the nation. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Kevin. It's always nice to hear how well things are being run in Utah, and we're weathering the storm quite nicely in that sense. So next up, we get a real treat. We get to hear from Senator Dan McCay. Senator Dan McCay represents District 11, which covers Salt Lake and portions of Utah County. He was a member of the House from 2012 to 2018 and has been in the Senate since then. And this year, he is the chair of the Senate Revenue and Taxation Committee. And he'll be talking about tax relief for Utahns and all that's going on in the Senate this session. So let's welcome to the stage Senator Dan McCay.
Thank you all. For those of you who are here in person, it's good to see your faces. And those of you who are not in person, I really appreciate you staying away. I don't like some of your faces, so this is a really nice change to only see the nice-looking people here. So this year, obviously, I'm new to the Senate side, revenue taxation, but for those of you who've been around the legislature a long time, you know that tax policy is not something new to me. This last 2019, which feels like eons ago, or was that? Yeah, end of 2019. We focused on and dealt with tax reform. Tax reform was a Herculean effort to try and address some of our systemic imbalances. And obviously, for those of you that were paying attention, it was largely very popular with the public, and it garnered a lot of support from the grocery stores as well, and the grocery industry. And as a result, we repealed the bill in January, the beginning of the session, and we went to looking for another alternative. And you know, it's tough when you look back on those policies. Would the constitutional amendment have passed absent mitigating factors, like, for example, the tax reform and its publicized difficulties in getting that passed? Would it have passed? I don't know. The other question, you know, when something like that comes up is, would tax reform have, passed at the ballot side? And should the legislature have waited? Should we try to pass a limp-along budget from, January, or I guess when the fiscal year takes place, to when the people would have voted? Would it have been meaningful to have that? I've had a number of constituents say that they were willing to vote for it after they learned more. I'm not sure if that's actually something that would have taken place. At least the voters approved it. My problem was, in order to convince somebody that tax reform was good, meaningful policy, I'd have to sit with them for 45 minutes to an hour. And you guys know how hard it is to listen to me for 5 minutes. Can you imagine for an hour? So it became very difficult, honestly, to try and get that policy through. And then shortly thereafter, after we repealed it, legislative leadership said they wanted to come back to a bad idea that I'd had the previous year, which was amending the Constitution. And in the process of amending the Constitution, Representative Mike Schultz and Senator Ann Millner, the assistant whip at the time, made some significant, and I would argue Herculean. I mean, my name was on the bill for the constitutional amendment, but when you look at the accompanying House bill that was passed, and that had Representative Spendlove's name on it, it had the fingerprints, and I'd say it was more than fingerprints. It was the hard work and effort of Senator Millner and Representative Schultz, and their efforts to make the constitutional amendment something that education can support. And if you remember, in our November elections, instead of it being this large fight, and money coming in on both sides and trying to solve it, which is what we thought might happen, their work and working with the education community to get some assurances so that education community wouldn't be harmed in the process was important. And I look at their efforts, and I honestly, as a lawmaker with a little bit of experience now, admire what they came up with and the solutions that they came up with. Because it largely, when President Adams asked me if I'd be the Senate Rev and Tax Chair, I said, well, what are we going to do for a few years? I mean, tax reform's done. What else is there to do? And so he asked me, for those of you here in the audience only, if you'll reach under your chairs, just go ahead, take a look under your chairs. There's a tax cut for everyone underneath that chair. Feel like Oprah in some ways. You get a tax cut, you get a tax cut, and yeah, even you get a tax cut. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can look at the additional revenue that we have at the state level. I think that certainly warrants some one-time cuts as far as an income tax rate, so that we make sure that we've put ourselves in a position fiscally to be sound. And I think that can be done for both individuals and for corporations. I think the other part of this too, that is important really for me. I have a number of constituents who are still concerned about the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act and the impact that it had on the child tax exemptions. And so the difficulties that presented for some families. That was a hard spot for a lot of families. They saw, between $2,500 and $5,000 increases in their income tax, and for families, that's a big number. So I think working on those components will be very important. And so, other than that, I think Rev and Tax will be a very pretty much a calm committee for the most part. I'm certain we'll find some ways to make things interesting, so I'd encourage you to tune in. This legislative session is going to be a very different legislative session, obviously. Fortunately, again, you guys are far away from me, so you can't catch the antibodies that I have. And I think, it's going to be important for tax practitioners, I think, this next year and the legal community, because we are dealing with heady tax policy issues, to weigh in. And so for that purpose, I'll give out my mobile number. If you've got a pen and paper there, don't all rush at once. But it's 801-810-4110. As the chair of Rev and Tax, I think it's important that we not shortcut the public process. It is my number one concern about this upcoming legislative session, and especially in our tax policy and tax committee. And so if it comes to you that there's an issue, please do reach out and call me. A text works as well. An email is nothing more than a penny wished down a fountain, or in a well. So anyway, for that purpose, I think I've exceeded my time, and I appreciate you all being here today and taking interest in tax policy. And thanks to taxpayers for having this conference. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator McCay. Next up, for those involved in tax policy in Utah, everybody knows that our next speaker very well. Steve Young, and I can factually say I'm introducing Steve Young, who played football for BYU. I can actually say that because, as you might know, there are two of them. Steve is a partner at the law firm of Holland & Hart. Steve was voted by his colleagues to be a fellow of the American College of Tax Counsel. He is vice chair of the State and Local Tax Committee of the Tax Section of the American Bar Association and past president of the Tax Section of the Utah State Bar. He routinely speaks and publishes nationwide on state and local tax issues. He also sits on the board of editors of the ABA Property Tax Desk Book and the Journal of Multi-State Taxation. And today Steve's going to be talking about an important topic in Utah, as well as the nation, but taxation in the rapidly changing telecom industry and a few other areas. Welcome, Steve Young.
Thank you, Rusty. I appreciate the introduction. My football career in college was actually at the University of Utah, not BYU, so that hurt just a little bit, but thank you. Thank you. Appreciate the chance to be here and to talk about an important issue that we've really been dealing with for several years, and we're hopeful that it's going to come to fruition, and appreciate the Taxpayers Association and their work on this issue over time. It involves property tax on telecommunications properties. 1876, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone on the 100th anniversary of our country. 1896, Utah becomes a state 20 years later. 2 years after that, we adopted our statute, which imposes property tax on telecommunications property. As you see on the screen, we had one primary telephone company at the time, Rocky Mountain Bell Telephone Corporation. Provided telecommunication service for virtually everybody in the state, and the statute that was created was basically designed for that one entity and then some small rural telecommunications companies as well. Fast forward now to 2020, and if we go to the next slide, we now have telecommunications products and services provided by numerous entities, as you see on the screen. On the left side, Comcast, Google, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Zoom, some which I hadn't even heard of a year ago, Zoom and WebEx and things like that, which now I talk on virtually every day. On the right, those that a lot of us have been familiar with for quite some time, AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon. T-Mobile merged with Sprint recently, so that one is, the numbers have shrunk on the right. Lumen, which formerly was CenturyLink, is there on the right, and Spock, So we now telecommute with other people in all kinds of different ways. The problem is that we don't tax these competing telecommunications companies the same. Every company on the left is locally assessed in Utah and is taxed through what we call a replacement cost approach, where we basically just go out and calculate what it would cost to replace all of the equipment that they use in the telecommunications industry. That's uniform, it's predictable, it's fair, it's done around the country, as I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Those on the right are all centrally assessed, And they are taxed by valuing the entire enterprise, not just the telecommunications piece, because they're all involved in other businesses now as well, media, other finance, insurance, et cetera. And the entire enterprise is picked up. And then the tax commission does their best, and they do their best, you know, this has been happening for decades, to try to pull out the non-taxable property, and about 80% of the property in telecommunications businesses is intangible or non-operating property. And so I've spent much of my career for 25 years as a lawyer litigating cases on the right and how to properly remove intangible property or non-operating property from those taxpayers on the right. It's a mess, it's problematic, it's a concern. We've got constant litigation in the state, and in theory, when you properly remove the intangibles and non-operating property, you should get to the same value as you do on the left. But because of the stickiness and the messiness of it, it takes a whole lot of work, and it never quite gets there, and you even have no uniformity on the companies on the right because they have different amounts of intangible property depending on what's on their books or depending on what they don't book. Maybe they haven't had an acquisition, so one company has more goodwill than another. One has more booked or unbooked licenses than another. It ends up being extremely unfair, unpredictable, and fraught with extensive litigation, which is why we've been discussing for years, what do we do? And there are really two options. Number one, you can try to move all the companies over on the left over to the right and tax them all the same. But what that's going to do is just exacerbate 100-fold the problems that we already have. You're suddenly creating a whole lot more intangible property analysis, a whole lot more non-operating property, because a lot of the companies on the left started as non-communications companies and now have gotten into the communications business, and you're only going to create a worse problem. The other option is to take all the companies on the right and value them the way the companies on the left are valued. That's by far the more predictable, fair, uniform, and reasonable approach, and that's what we've been in discussions with the Taxpayers Association and various others to try to come up with legislation this year that would do just that. Not only is that more fair and predictable and uniform, it's also much more consistent with what's going on around the rest of the country. If we look at the next slide, this shows the tax system that's used in every state in America. And if you'll see, first of all, the gray states don't even tax personal property. Those states all just exempt it out, you know, completely, which we've talked about in Utah, but we've never taken that step. But all of the other light green states have done exactly what I've suggested with locally assessed property, which is happening in Utah, which is a replacement cost approach where all the property is uniform and predictable. You don't have to mess with, you know, what is intangible and what's not, what's operating property and what's not. It's clear, it's clean, it's predictable, and has made sense for all these other states for many years, and really would make a lot of sense for Utah to do as well. And that's what we're hopeful will happen. Now the question is, what about the fiscal impact of this? It's property tax, so it's not going to cost the state or local governments anything. It will simply, you know, create obviously a shift amongst taxpayers. But in our calculation, with the $284 billion of value in this state, the difference in value between what's happening now with the companies on the right and what would happen under a replacement cost approach is very, very small. And so it should have a very, very small fiscal shift impact in our $22 billion state budget that the governor just put out. You know, we feel like it's very insignificant, and have had discussions with the tax commission, the counties, and several others to try to get everybody on the same page to make this happen. So watch for that. Talked to Senator Bramble about a bill to make this happen, and are hopeful that can move through the session this year so that we can overcome this problem that we've had for several years. A couple other bills that Rusty asked me to speak to. that we've been working with the Taxpayers Association on. And because I'm a litigator, these come up in our litigation cases consistently, and so we've had these discussions going forward. Number one deals with confidentiality. When we do our property tax system at the Tax Commission, it's completely reliant on voluntary compliance by taxpayers, just like our income tax system. We ask taxpayers to basically divulge anything and everything about their business, their plans, and their secret sauce so that we can properly value them. The problem is that creates significant confidentiality concerns, and taxpayers aren't going to give you the information. They're not going to give information to the government if the government's not going to protect it. Back in 2004, then Senator Stephenson sponsored confidentiality legislation to make sure that this secret sauce information that's given to the government is never disclosed outside of the government, and that's been a great statute. It's worked very, very well. But there's a couple of loopholes in that statute that are creating continued problems, and every time we have a litigation case, we have to go litigate about protective orders and getting those in place to make sure that there's continued confidentiality. The two loopholes are, number one, information that's given to other states, because a lot of other states don't have our confidentiality protections, and if the information goes to other state or local governments, then it can make its way out into the economy to competitors or whatever. So that's one problem. The other problem deals with expert witnesses in litigation who are not covered by the statute, so we're always having to enter these protective orders. So the statute would basically just require those two loopholes to be closed so that every time anybody files an appeal of a property tax case, there is no need for a protective order. Our statute's airtight, and there's no concern that anybody's secret sauce is going to be inadvertently disclosed outside of the case. So that's number one. Another statute that we're looking at deals with stays of cases. Right now, in almost every case, income tax, property tax, when you appeal, by the time you get a decision, there's more than 1 year that has stacked up in the system. So maybe you have a 2007 income tax case, and by the time you get a decision, you're in 2011. So there's 4 years that have stacked up in the meantime. Well, the problem is when we get to court for the 2007 case, the 2008, 9, 10, 11 cases are at the Tax Commission. This is true for property and income tax. And we end up with the question of, do we go forward with the later years, or do we wait for the district court case? And historically, we've always had a system where everybody agreed that we should just wait, let the district court case be decided first, and then the rest of the cases get resolved. But recently, we've gotten pushback from governmental entities who have basically been saying, well, we know there's one case in court, but there's these other cases at the Tax Commission, and let's go make the taxpayer litigate all of them at the same time. And that's gotten some traction, and that's a significant concern to taxpayers because it basically allows the government to squash taxpayers into compliance. Because they can say, okay, not only do you have to fight this battle, but this battle and this battle and this battle, and it's already expensive enough for taxpayers who have the burden of proof to prevail in these cases, but now you got to do it on 4 battlefronts at the same time. It simply is unfair for the taxpayer. So the legislation would say anytime you have one tax year for any tax case, income or property or sales tax, in court, all related cases for the same taxpayer, which are pending at the Tax Commission, would be stayed pending that court case. So that's basically the 3 bills, and I appreciate the chance to be here today. Thanks.
I'll certainly understand if Steve never wants to talk to me again after saying you played football for BYU. I can't believe I butchered that. I just need to stick to the script from here on out, I think, and just read exactly what's written down. As a lifelong Ute, I feel terrible for saying that. No offense to those that are more blue than I am. Our last 2 speakers have a large reservoir of institutional knowledge, and we're looking forward to hearing from our last two speakers. First of all, our current state auditor, John Dougall. We welcome him, and we're excited to hear from him. He's going to talk about the past and the future in Utah and policy, taxation, and budgeting, and what have you. He served in the House of Representatives for 10 years, from 2003 to 2013, and then he's been our state auditor since 2013. And a key factor in his long resume is that he was a key member involved in a lot of the major tax reform that was done quite some time ago now, back in 2006 to 2008 timeframe, and perhaps he'll mention that as well. But let's welcome to the stage our state auditor, John Dougall.
I'll note that while I'm a BYU grad, I did not have a football career there or anywhere. First thing, when it comes to tax policy, yeah, I did have the privilege of serving on the Tax Reform Task Force in 2005 and helping carry legislation to reform our tax system in the 2008 general session. It was a lot of work to do tax reform. It takes a lot of work to analyze it, takes a lot of work to bring the public along and everything else like that. But at the end of the day, I think that the changes that we made were instrumental. First, helping Utah recover quickly in the Great Recession, one of many factors. I also think it was beneficial this past year with the whole pandemic. At the end of the day, when we lighten the burden on the citizens, it allows them to better control their lives and to better drive the economy. The other thing that I think too many people forget is that businesses don't really pay taxes. They're an intermediary organization. Okay? At the end of the day, customers, employees, and shareholders pay taxes. And depending on the dynamics in the economy, it shifts to those folks differently. But businesses don't really pay taxes. And the public doesn't fully understand that. They think there's buckets of money there and it's just free money and we should just tax companies. But what that does, from my perspective, is it weakens our economy, it weakens our businesses, and it causes them to engage in a lot of wasteful planning to try and figure out how to mitigate their tax burden and still perform their company obligations. One of the things I want to touch on a little bit is the importance of transparency. Each year, the Taxpayers Association reviews budgets of all counties, major cities, and large special districts during the truth in taxation process. This is when they're looking to raise taxes, property tax. Entities are required to make their budgets public so the public can review that. Recently, in one of their reviews, they found one large special district that, while you could grandma request the budget, it was not just readily available on a website or something like that for folks to see. And so I share their concern that it's critical that this information is readily available to the public. They shouldn't have to jump through extra hoops to get it. And so Representative Moss is going to run a bill to clarify the expectations when it comes to publishing these draft budgets and final budgets through that truth in taxation process, or just through the budgetary process in general. When we talk about transparency, I'm going to describe that there's Transparency 1.0, which is grandma requests, saying that the public can request records and see that information. I'll describe Transparency 2.0 is more shifting into massive data dumps. So if you look at Transparent Utah, the financial transparency website, there's tons of information in there. But it's hard for the public to analyze it. But Transparency 2.0 were these massive data dumps to get records out there for the public. I think Transparency 3.0 is what we're entering today, where you're seeing more and more folks start to curate the data. That could be folks like the Taxpayers Association, the Salt Lake Tribune, other research or advocacy organizations taking that data and analyzing it and reporting on it in a curated fashion that is easier for their public, for their constituency to understand what government is doing. I hope that we get to what I call Transparency 4.0. This is where governmental entities actually focus on transparency in their process, so that what they see in their decision-making activities is the same thing that the public sees. that it is transparent in what they're analyzing, how they go about making their decisions, and it's just fully seamless and integrated, and it's not extra hoops out here or some data but not other data. But you can fully see what in my case, my mayor sitting here on the front row, what my city is doing in terms of various activities and various decisions that they're making. And I hope that we get there. One of the key things I get asked a lot about, and I know the Taxpayers Association cares a lot about this as well, is spending in public education. I get asked two key questions. Where does the money really go, and how well is it spent? And for too often, folks didn't really know where it went. I mean, when I would ask, how much does it cost to run this school? Most school districts couldn't answer the question. If I asked, how much do we spend on math instruction or science instruction or language arts across the district, across the state, nobody could tell me. And so we've been working on a very innovative performance audit we call Project Kids. And we are integrating all sorts of information from the transparency website, from the State Board of Education, from school districts, LEAs across the state to take financial and performance and other information and integrate it together into a set of dashboards. And we initially focused on helping the LEAs understand where the money was going so they could better answer the question of, is that what they intended and how well is that money being spent? During this year, you're going to see us start to release more of those dashboards publicly so various other public stakeholders can start to weigh in of what they think. And one of the interesting dynamics is we're drilling that money all the way down to the student level so we can see what is the first order approximation of spending on a student-by-student basis. So then we can roll it up into the course, the class, the school, the curricular topic, whatever it might be. And anecdotally, we were visiting with one superintendent a few months ago, and he said, first I'll ask a question. From your perspective, if you look at extracurricular activities, what single activity do you think high schools spend the most money on? Football. Football. That's what you would think. In this school district, he said, I knew we spent a lot on cheer. I had no idea we spent that much on cheer. In this school district, they spent more on cheer and drill team individually than they spent on football. Okay? They had no idea, they had no clue that was the case. And so we're hoping with Project Kids to start to better help folks understand where the money's going so they can make better decisions about how well that money's being spent. And the reason I bring that up is at the end of the day, the clamor for taxes and the desire to spend taxes rests on what people think they need money for. And if we have a better understanding of how well that money is being spent and where it's being spent, I believe we'll make better decisions and stop placing such a great burden on the taxpayers. So thank you so much. I appreciate the invite.
Thank you, Auditor Dougall. That was great to hear. Music to our ears once again. So our last speaker doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. So Howard Stephenson has been the president of the Utah Taxpayers Association, or with the Taxpayers Association, for 44 years. As you also know, he was a state senator for District 11 from 1992 to 2018 for 26 years. He was chair of all kinds of committees. I'm sure I'll leave some out if I start naming them off: Rev and Tax, Education, various appropriations, what have you. I often tell people, in learning about how education is funded in the state of Utah, there are very, very, very few people that totally understand exactly how it's funded. And Howard Stephenson is one of them. It's a very small crowd. And it's tough for us to realize that this will be Howard's last legislative outlook conference with the Taxpayers Association. He'll be retiring April 15th, of all days, of 2021 from the Taxpayers Association. 44 years ago, almost to the day on April 1st, he started at the Taxpayers Association, and then President Jack Olson thought it would be funny and gave him a pink slip the day that he started his job. and played a joke on him that he had lost a job on his first day. But Jack Olson, he was president until the mid-'80s, and then Howard Stephenson has led the ship since then. So without further ado, let's welcome to the stage, I'll still call him Senator Howard Stephenson.
Thanks, Rusty. When I began at the Taxpayers Association in 1977, April 1st, April Fool's Day, it was my personal goal to ensure that Utah becomes the best economic state in the nation. And it took a lot of doing to working with a lot of people who had a similar vision. And we can say for the last 13 years that we have had the best economic outlook, according to Art Laffer and the experts. I'm honored to have been a part of this process. And as you can see, we are in good hands going forward with Rusty and Spencer and Autumn to continue the work of this association. And I'm looking for them to take it to the next level to improve on what we have, and I'm confident they will. I'm going to talk about something that is related to education spending, which is really unfortunate in the state of Utah. The chart that you have up here was produced by the legislative fiscal analyst. It shows all 41 school districts and the yield they get per student per tax increment. So this is the amount generated per student per tax increment in the brown or the rust-colored bars. That's what they generate locally. Over the last several years, I and some others have worked with Senator Osmond and Senator Fillmore and others to fill in the gaps that are below that in those watermarks. The green part brought them up quite a ways, and then we passed some other legislation to bring up the blue mark and then the rust mark on top of that. This is a little bit old. Right now, Park City is raising around $360 per student per tax increment, while Tintic produces just a fraction of that. Now, who created that inequity? You know, we've overcome it to some degree, as you can see that water line there. But who created that inequity? The legislature did, because they set in place the mechanisms by which schools are funded. And so we do have equalization when it comes to the WPU, the weighted pupil unit, and other funding on a per student basis. But the disequalizing component is the extreme differences in the property tax yield per student per tax increment. And by the way, what you don't see behind this chart is that the tax rates of the school districts that are receiving the least amount per tax increment are extremely high, and the tax rates of Park City are the lowest in the state. And you'll see that in a minute on another chart when I get into another topic. I was so pleased to get a text from Rusty's predecessor at the Taxpayers Association, former Vice President Billy Hesterman, who during this conference said, I'm watching simultaneously the governor's press conference and the Taxpayers Association conference. And you'll be pleased to know, he said, that the governor made it a huge issue to overcome the disparity that you see on this chart. This is the first time that a governor has made this a priority. So hopefully, with the legislature pushing forward and the governor continuing to help with this, we will get the water to the end of the row so that we can get everybody up to second place. We'll never reach Park City, but if we got everybody up to second place, school districts would be able to compete for talented educators rather than cannibalizing from the lowest paying districts. We would have equity. As Governor Cox said in his campaign materials, we need to ensure that no student has a less of an opportunity in education because of their zip code. and hopefully we'll be able to get this done. You may be interested to know that many of those lowest funded school districts have actually been fighting over the last decade the attempts the legislature has made to get this done. And in talking with them, I've just met with several of them a week ago, and I finally realized that they have always put unity of their tribal group of all the school districts, that unity among school districts is more important than equity for any school child. And when I explained it to them that way, several of them said, wow, that's exactly what we've been doing. We've been thinking that our tribe as school boards and school districts across the state, our unity in working with the tribe of the legislature and getting funding, that we need to stay together unified, and so we're never going to go to correct this problem. That is changing. They finally realized that equity for all children is more important than unity among the different school districts. So I look for great things to happen this year and in the years to come as this inequity is overcome. Let's go to the next chart, which talks about tax increment financing and the amounts that school districts give for tax increment financing. As you know, tax increment financing started 70, 80 years ago in the United States when you had brownfields or really run-down places in an inner city that actually had, the property had negative value because everything was dilapidated, and if you were to try to sell that property to redevelop it, you would actually have to pay more money than it was worth to get that done. And so tax increment financing would take the new value done by developers and take that property taxes from the new value for 20 years or so and give it to the developers so that it would offset the negative value of property. Well, tax increment financing has changed drastically since then. It has been a runaway train with developers wanting to get retail or homes or whatever in green fields that had very high value. And so the problem we have right now is that there are school districts that are contributing to the tax increment financing far and above what any other school district does. I'd like to use the example of the Tooele School District in red, which has a tax rate of 0.007904, and compare that down further in green, Park City, their tax rate is 2763, a third of the rate of Tooele. And so when a tax increment financing deal comes through, the people who do a project in Tooele are taking 3 times more from school children than they do in Park City. And look at Salt Lake City. That's a competitor for tax increment financing and development in Tooele, and their tax rate is half the tax rate of Tooele. So we've got a bill that will be sponsored in the coming session that will say that no school district in the state can contribute a greater tax increment than would be generated by the average rate of all school districts across the state. So in other words, the poor districts like Tooele that have so little to educate their kids, and yet their tax rates are the highest in the state, that when a tax increment deal is done, the school board will be limited to give away no more than the average school district in the state would give on the same value of the project. That would then give, on the first day of the construction, when it's put in place, that school district would finally have more money. So your Taxpayers Association has been working to ensure that every kid gets an equal opportunity in this state. And with the passage of these 2 pieces of legislation, we hope to get the water to the end of the road. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Howard. We appreciate that. Well, thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. We really appreciate it. Once again, we want to thank our sponsors today, Comcast, Sinclair, Rio Tinto, and Micron, as well as we want to thank Doug Johnson Productions. They do an excellent job on live streaming. Highly recommend them for those that are doing meetings like this. And that is the end of our program. So thank you for tuning in today, and thank you for attending. Thank you. And the board meeting will start at noon right over in the next room for those board members that are here. Thank you.